Before we get to today's stories, I would like to say a disclaimer. The stories presented in this video delve into themes that might be unsettling for some viewers, including graphic descriptions and eerie scenarios. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. These tales aren't for the faint of heart. If my chilling content sends shivers down your spine and leaves you craving more, please subscribe to my channel. Your support means the world to me. I'm seeing creatures out of the corner of my eye, and I know they're real. I'm bringing this here because I need people to believe me. No matter what I say to friends and family, they laugh it off and suggest me a therapist, or call me schizophrenic. This all started 2 months ago in early December, when I got a phone call from my best friend's mother. This wasn't out of the ordinary, as I was basically part of the family. Me and my best friend, Colin, used to be inseparable. We exchanged small talk for a while, but her tone darkened when she told me why she called this time. Rather than the usual where she just checks in to see if I'm out of food or not, she said she had called to tell me that Colin had found dead the night before. The news came as a shock to me, of course. I had seen him just 4 days before she called, and he'd been in perfect health and super happy, though he did seem just a bit more paranoid than usual. It made me think that maybe there might have been foul play. However, she then let me know that it was an apparent suicide. He was found in his room, lying dead in a blood-soaked bed, wrists and stomach cut up. The knife that had done the damage was found laying on the ground near the foot of the bed. I thanked her for telling me what had happened to Colin and offered her any sort of aid I could give her, whether that be financial, emotional, or whatever else I may need to provide. I won't lie, I had teared up and I talked mostly through sobs. She was talking the same, and I could hear her husband attempting to comfort her through the phone. Then she let me know that Colin had left something to me. She said it was a collection of about 5 different notebooks that Colin had said should not be looked through by anyone but me. I asked her if she knew why Colin wanted me to be the one he trusted with the notebooks, but she said she had no idea. We exchanged a few memories of Colin through more tears, but eventually she wished me a good one and hung up. Fast forward 2 weeks, where Christmas is less than a week away, and I have the notebooks laid out across my bed. In the 2 weeks since she'd called me, we'd held a small funeral for Colin and had him cremated. His parents kept the ashes, I believe. She had passed the notebooks unto me just before she pulled out of the parking lot. It was late at night, probably sometime past 2 in the morning. I grabbed the first notebook and brought it to the desk in the corner of the room. I read by the light of the lamp next to me. The first page was a small paragraph of messy writing. Dear Blue, I hope that you're the one that's reading this. If you have these, I've probably been killed. I discovered some time ago that the things I was seeing weren't just figments of my imagination. They'll be the things that kill me. The writing was of course addressed to me. I had recently changed my name to Blue within the past 3 months. That meant this note was written somewhat recently. I flipped to the next page and my jaw dropped. All across the page were drawings of tall, humanoid creatures with weird-looking eyes. There was no empty space between the drawings, as he'd filled the space up with words. They were all things you'd expect of one of the insane. They're real, and he sees me, as well as stuff like, who else can see them? It was unsettling, of course. I flipped through the rest of the book, finding dozens of different variations of the creature. Some where it was shorter but larger, some where it was unreasonably tall and gaunt, where the arms looked like they were missing flesh, just skin stretched over bones. I reached the end of the first notebook and felt my hands shake. I pushed the notebook aside and reached for the next one. I flipped through this one and the rest and found the same thing in each. That is, except for the final page on the last book. I knew this was the last book because they were numbered in permanent marker across the front, with his name in pen beneath the large numbers. This one was marked with the number 5. At the end was another paragraph written just like the first one. This one looked like it was written hurriedly, and I noticed a few dots where the lined paper seemed to have had the blue lines curl, as if something had dripped onto the page. It wrote, Blue, This is the last you'll ever hear from me. I saw it again. I hear it now. It won't leave a trace. It's smarter than we think it is. It has a knife." The rest of the note was unintelligible. I closed the notebook and only then noticed I had been holding my breath. My heart was beating fast in my chest. I never thought some drawings and words could scare me this much. I pondered calling Colin's mother, but thought better of it as it was some time past 3 now. I decided to call it a night as well. As I turned off the lamp and piled the notebooks on the corner of the desk, I swore I could see something moving out the window from the corner of my eye. But every time I glanced back out the window, there was nothing there. I thought that maybe my lack of sleep was getting to me. I laid in bed and tried to sleep. It took me around an hour to fall asleep. I was tossing and turning the whole night, thinking about Colin and his weird notebooks. Now we skip ahead to late January. I had been seeing things out of the corner of my eye for the last month, and I felt as if I was starting to lose my mind. I had begun going to therapy, but immediately stopped going when they suggested me pills. In the beginning, I would have jumped at the opportunity, but after some time I started to believe it was real. Then, that one night in January, this all turned from 10 to 100 real quick. I had just parked my car in my parking spot in front of my apartment and unloaded some of the groceries I had just bought. I made a few trips, and as I brought the last few bags inside, I walked back outside to lock the car. The moment I opened the door, I froze where I was. Right there, sitting in the passenger seat of my car, was a familiar creature. A tall, seemingly fleshless creature with skin as white as the moon sat staring down at its legs. Its knees were at its chest, and its feet were down off the seat. It must have been scarily tall. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt my vision go blurry. I blinked a few times, and finally felt myself regain control of my body. I took a step back, slowly backing into my apartment. I reached for the door behind me and moved to shut it. The moment I touched the door, the creature's head shot up, and it was staring me dead in the eyes, with eyes that seemed to take the light away. They were almost like holes in its face that led into the void. As it saw the fear on my face, its lips slowly curled upwards into an unnatural and terrifying smile. I leapt back and slammed the door, then locked it, and quickly rushed to find a chair to lodge beneath the doorknob and the floor as an added measure of security. I ran to my room and collapsed after shutting the door and closing the blinds. I broke into sobs immediately, realizing that if this was the thing that killed Colin, I was surely next. I was going to die. I tried to get it together, to be able to clear my head enough to know I'd make smarter decisions. I needed it. I began muttering to myself out loud, "I'm not gonna die. I won't die. I won't let myself fucking die. I can't." I trailed off and began breathing slower. I felt myself calm down, and eventually I was able to relax my tensed muscles. I stood up after a moment of breathing and walked back out to the front door, where I peered through the peephole at my car, and it was empty. No demonic creature staring a hole through my soul. I was safe. After that interaction, I was paranoid constantly. Every time I turned a corner in a grocery store, it felt my anxieties spike. Every time I heard the heater turn on in my apartment, I nearly brought myself to tears. It's been a month now since I've seen the creature like I had during the end of January. I'd still been seeing the thing, and its many variations, just like the ones in the books, out of the corner of my eye every time the moon was out. Today, I looked at the notebooks and called a friend of mine, getting ready to confess my fears and the things I was seeing. I told him everything, and he laughed and told me to go see a therapist. I laughed with him, acting as though everything was fine. In reality, I was pissed at him. If he won't believe me, nobody will. So now I bring this here. I still see it. I'm starting to think the books are the cause of this. I wonder if burning them will fix this curse. I need advice. I don't know if these things can be killed or what the limit of their power is. I just know they scare the shit out of me. Please help me wherever you can. Death lives in the South Pole. Madness as a concept, in my opinion, is widely misportrayed in some modern media. Padded rooms and mindless actions are not always the form that madness takes. Einstein defined insanity as the repetition of the same action paired with the hope of a changing outcome. I don't disagree necessarily, but I do believe he was talking about a different kind of insanity than what I have become familiar with. I think that madness can be logical in and of itself. That is, I believe someone can be changed so deeply that their concept of what is logical no longer fits the expected societal norm. This is the type of madness that I have become familiar with over the past few years. I believe it to be far worse, far more sinister, far more dangerous. I'm an ex-military man. I've never been quite the brightest, but I can take orders and I've got good survival instincts. I joined the army right after high school, not knowing what else to do with myself. It was a temporary fix, but when I got out, I was just as lost as I was before. I ended up taking odd jobs that I figured would be close enough to the military that I'd be competent at them. Mostly, I've worked as a bodyguard for various B-list celebrities. I make a decent enough living, though, and I'm not unhappy with my life. But 2 years ago, I got an email from someone I didn't recognize, a Dr. Fitz. Not the medicine type of doctor. He was an archaeologist. I looked him up. He's pretty well known and respected, the rich philanthropist type. Or was, I guess. His email was pretty vague. He introduced himself and invited me out to dinner the next day. It was some fancy Italian place I never would have stepped foot in otherwise, at least not as a customer. We chatted for a bit, exchanging pleasantries and making jokes. I didn't expect him to be, but Dr. Fitz was a nice guy. He had a good head on his shoulders, something that I find to be rare among famous people. Admittedly, I was about 4 drinks in at this point. Not drunk, but loose and comfortable. After we finished eating, his demeanor shifted. He leaned in, voice lowered. "I'm sorry if I've breached your privacy, but I had some of my employees look into you. I wanted to be sure about you, and now that I am, I've got a job you'd be perfect for. You'll be paid well. From what I understand, I'd estimate I can offer you the equivalent of what you normally make in a year." I sat silent for a little, taken aback by the change in conversation. "You ran some kind of background check on me? Why?" "Yes. Like I said, I needed to be sure of you. From the sound of it, you seem like someone who can keep quiet when needed, and I need protection." "Protection from what? Aren't you an archaeologist? I thought you guys just dug up dinosaur bones. If you want me to take this job of yours, you'll need to stop being vague." His eyes scanned the nearly empty restaurant. Just a couple of people left across from us. Apparently satisfied, he leaned in and spoke again, still hushed. "I found something big. Honestly, the less you know about it, the better for both of us. But what I can say is that if I'm right, and if we can find what I'm betting on, it'll rewrite human history." Needless to say, I was skeptical. "Listen, Dr. Fitz, my dad taught me that if something seems too good to be true, it probably is. I'm no super soldier. Why would some famous doctor buy me dinner and then offer me $100,000 for one job?" He smiled. "I don't need super soldiers. I need people who can do as they're told and can keep their mouth shut. Correct me if I'm wrong, but you seem like just the man for the task." I couldn't disagree. In most things, I would say I'm painfully average. But what I have always excelled at, from childhood until now, is doing what other people tell me. And honestly, his offer was tempting. Not just because of the money, but because of what he had said. If I was a part of some job that could change history, I could finally tell myself that I'm somebody. That I did something with my life out of the ordinary. Something that stood out in a sea of thoughtless mundanity and monotony. I don't have kids. Not yet, at least. But this was a chance for me to show future generations who I was. A chance to be remembered. I was surprised that I wanted this. I had never sought recognition before, but maybe I just never believed I could accomplish it. But here it was, the chance staring me in the face. I couldn't say no. I held my hand out to him across the table. He smiled and shook it. "When do I start?" Still shaking my hand excitedly, the young doctor spoke more excitedly than he had our entire conversation. "Tonight. You won't be needing anything, so don't worry about packing. You and I are heading to the airport right now." I wanted to protest, but he had checked my history. He knew as well as I did that I had nothing waiting for me at home. So we did as he had said. One of his employees drove us to the airport where we met up with another group of people. Taking a head count, it was me, the doctor, a gruff middle-aged man and a young woman. They introduced themselves as Vince, a demolitions expert, and Dana, an anthropologist and linguist. We all got along well enough, but they were a quiet bunch. Fitz and Dana spent the first hours of our flight chatting about things I didn't really understand. I caught words here and there. Ruins, carvings, artifacts. Nothing I could really make an inference off of without any context. After 3 hours of flying, I knocked out. Sure, I wanted to know where we were going, but I had already taken the deal. It's not like I was going to turn back now. When I woke up, we were already descending. I looked out the window to see nothing but mountains, ice, and snow. I recognized this place from nature documentaries I would watch late at night when I couldn't sleep. "You took us to the North Pole?" I asked, a bit outraged. Dana answered, "The South Pole, actually." I stared at them both, confused and more than a little annoyed. "What the hell does an archaeologist want with snow and penguins?" Fitz smirked, a little too pleased with himself. "It's not snow or penguins we're after. It's history." I wasn't in the mood for his games. "Just tell me what we're doing here. What exactly is it you're after?" He exhaled slowly, like he was weighing his words. "If I told you, you wouldn't believe me, but you'll see soon enough. Just be patient." Again, I was frustrated. But what was I supposed to do? Swim back? We touched down on a tiny airstrip at the base of a mountain range. The base consisted of 5 buildings that I was told we would be staying in until we were ready to depart the next day. From the sound of it, we were going up those mountains. There was no objection from me. Like I said before, doing physical labor at the behest of others is how I've made my living up until now. A hike through the snow wasn't enough to scare me off, but I wish it had been. I made myself at home in the room they assigned me, showered, ate, and then drank with Vince. He's quiet, like I said, but a few shots loosened him up slightly. Like Fitz, I thought he was a good guy. He told me he had been in the French military, and that's how he got into his profession as a demolitions expert. That's really all I could get out of him. My alarm woke me early the next morning, and I got ready for our trip. I'll spare you most of the details. It's pretty much what you'd expect. The South Pole is beautiful the same way a desert is. The vast expanse of nothing has its own charm, but at that moment I was cold and tired and not much else mattered to me. We hiked for most of the day, from 6 a.m. until 5 p.m. I figured we'd make camp, but the group wasn't stopping. After we summited yet another peak, I got a view of the valley below. Dr. Fitz had been right, this was going to change human history. Below us, in a valley surrounded by these steep cliffs, was a city. It looked foreign. I didn't recognize the architecture or even the materials it seemed to be made out of. It was dark, a jewel of onyx resting on a blanket of snow. Dr. Fitz, seeing how dumbfounded I was, slapped my back and said, "Told you so." I had a million questions all at once, but I only asked 2. What is that place? Who built it? Dana, unable to contain her excitement, spoke before the doctor could. We don't know the answer to either of those questions. That's what we're here for. An artifact surfaced a few years ago that suggested a lost civilization in the Arctic, one that may have even been from an advanced. That's enough, Dana. Sorry, Clay. The less you know about this place, the better it is for us all. All you need to know is that we're headed there for information, and you're here to keep us safe. That was the very thought that had been forming in my mind. Safe from what? I asked quietly. From rumors. I could tell by his tone that he wasn't going to elaborate. So, with a newfound caution and awe, I trudged with the group down the mountain until we made it to the city. The group had provided me with arms, a rifle and a sidearm. Along with this, Vince had a handgun and a backpack full of explosives. I felt prepared enough. Unless that abandoned city had a functioning army, we'd be just fine. Up close, the city was even more bizarre than I had thought. The walls and streets were lined with strange markings and symbols. I didn't recognize any of them, but Dana and Fitz were all over them. There was a juxtaposition that was almost funny. The two of them were like kids in a candy shop, while Vince and I were on edge and uneasy. The roads and buildings were made of the same materials. Smooth, dark obsidian and dense, weathered basalt, their cold surfaces reflecting the harsh environment around us. More than that, the city gave off this warmth that's hard for me to describe. It felt living, like the heat that comes off of a person. But more than just the stones they were made of, the buildings themselves were alien to me. Tall, angular structures that made no sense. Towers trailed up to the sky only to blossom into pyramids or some other geometric shapes that defied reason. Mazes of obelisks formed a forest of stone towards the heart of the great city. Following Fitz and Dana, our group trudged cautiously through the city with silent awe. Everyone had been silent for a good while now, too in awe of our surroundings to speak. Fitz and Dana took pictures, samples, and jotted notes furiously as we went. I spoke up. "We got what you guys wanted? We can turn back now, yeah?" Dr. Fitz seemed almost offended. "Turn back? We are at the greatest discovery in all of human history. We are not turning back until we see the end." The group didn't speak up, and I took their silence as agreement. So on we went. I'll warn you, reader, that this is the part where things stop being nice. If you're squeamish, maybe consider stopping here. The obelisk maze went on for what felt like longer than it should have. Honestly, I was convinced Fitz had us going in circles. By now it was around 9, but light wasn't an issue. Antarctica, as I learned, has what is known as a polar day, meaning the sun doesn't set for months. But it was still dim. The mountains encircling this place blocked the sun's rays, shrouding us in a veil of shadow. What was an issue were the noises. Bubbling, like a boiling soup, paired with slithering and squelching, came from every direction. Vince and I scanned our surroundings constantly, pointing our weapons nervously back and forth across our field of vision. At some point, Dana stopped. Her footsteps had made a sound that didn't align with those that had preceded it. Instead of a rocky click, her step had made a sickening squish. We all looked down to her foot, which was now ankle-deep in a greenish-black, semi-solid sludge. We followed the sludge with our eyes to reveal something that still haunts me. It started midway up one of the obelisks, where it sat like a slug, an amorphous being of yellow eyes and dark jelly-like biomatter. Its body trailed down the obelisk to the floor where Dana's foot had been caught like a snare. At first, it seemed like nothing. For a brief, tense moment, nothing happened. Then, Dana made the mistake of trying to yank her foot out. My guess is that these things work a bit like a spider's web. Motion must trigger them to action, because as soon as she did this, she began to scream and flail desperately, trying with all her might to free her foot. Vince and I tried to pull her out by her arms, but this only sped up the process. The sludge was crawling up her leg, now reaching just below her knee. And worse, it had begun to eat away at her. When I was a freshman in high school, I took a biology class. The only thing I can remember from it is a video about white blood cells and how they kill germs. It's pretty brutal. They engulf whatever it is they're after and digest it with enzymes, a mix of suffocating and dissolving. At that moment, that video was all I could think about. I fired off 4 rounds into the blob with no effect. The bullets pierced a hole through its surface only for it to be filled in again, like a stone dropping into a pond. I could see the bullets melting inside of it. By now, Dana's foot was mostly gone. Only loose bone was remaining. Her calf was quickly following suit. I could see her muscle melting off like cotton candy in water. I don't know if she was lucky or unlucky, but her leg came off below the knee. She was in shock, of course, but she was free from the monster. Vince immediately used his belt to tourniquet her leg, but we would need to carry her. I turned back, ready to guide us out of here, only for my heart to sink to my stomach. I don't know if these things could talk to each other, or if they just heard us screaming, but we were caged in by scores of those amorphous things. Going back the way we came wasn't an option. Fitz leading the way, Vince and I carried Dana in between us until we reached the middle. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but it wasn't this. There was a hole in the middle of the city. One so deep and so dark that I couldn't see the bottom, but we all knew what was behind us. The choice was being melted alive or risking death by falling, and it was an easy one. Fitz was the first to jump, but the rest of us followed suit quickly after. We fell for a long time. I'm not sure how long, but it felt like hours. I collided with the ground below with violent force. It was almost the strangest thing that had happened that day. I felt my body hit the floor with enough force to make me a pancake, but I wasn't hurt. My body, as far as I could tell, was unharmed by the fall. I got up, brushing myself off, to see Vince holding an unconscious Dana and Fitz standing dead still, looking out over our new surroundings. What the hell were though? My words died in my throat. We weren't in some dark cave. It was brighter than it had been outside that day. We stood in what I can only describe as an enormous throne room. Please don't misunderstand. When I say enormous, I mean that after what must have been miles of space was the end of the room. There, at the end of the cavernous chamber, was a throne the size of a skyscraper. It shifted and moved impossibly. It seemed like smoke or liquid the way it writhed, yet I know it was solid. It was dark, yet it exuded an unnatural light. Still, I almost didn't even notice it. Its occupant was not something I could look away from. It drew my eyes in like a black hole. To me, it took the form of a beast. 3 heads, each covered with glowing eyes of every color, and 4 draconian wings that spread out far enough to touch the walls of the room. Its skin was covered in dark, leathery scales. Every piece of it changed constantly like the throne it was seated on. Fitz was transfixed, staring at the beast with reverence. Reflecting on it now, I've grown to understand details about the events that followed this. Ones that I believe give me a deeper understanding of why this happened. Stories exist of monsters like this, of supernatural powers that are too much for a human, that merely looking at these beings can rip your sanity from you. But that isn't true. You see, you can look at them and be unharmed. I did, after all. What drives one to insanity is the understanding of it. You see, in the same way that an insect can observe a work of art, a human can observe these things. The insect has no understanding of it. It doesn't understand the love, hatred, passion, grief, or any other emotion that a work of art may portray. But if the insect were, for just a moment, to grasp the meaning of beauty and emotion, if higher knowledge were forced upon it in a fleeting instant, its entire understanding of purpose and logic would be irrevocably altered. Having seen this higher existence, it would give anything it could to regain this understanding. Its past life as an insect would be inconsequential in comparison to its new goal. I believe this is exactly what happened to Dr. Fitz. I don't know what he saw, and I don't ever want to know. Whatever it was, it changed him. He didn't care about fame, money, or even history anymore. His only drive was to see what he had been shown once again, to understand once more what his mind wasn't capable of understanding. Calmly, he turned and approached Vince, who was still caring for Dana, the latter of which had become semi-conscious. He took the handgun from the holster at his side and, without hesitation, executed Vince. Dana screamed with fresh horror. I aimed my gun at Fitz, who didn't pay me any mind. I yelled with as much conviction as I could muster, "Drop it!" Still, I got no reaction from him. He fell to his knees and began to scoop up Vince's blood from off of the floor. Using it, he drew symbols on his own face, torso, and arms, the same symbols that decorated the city above. In a panic, Dana crawled on her back away from the doctor, kicking against the floor with her one leg. This proved to be a mistake. She had positioned herself immediately below the cavern we had come down. Like a hellish rain, the amorphous cells from the city fell around her. Her screams crescendoed until they were cut off by the mass that fell on top of her. She was encased completely, silently screaming as the flesh melted from her bones. Soon, Dana had vanished completely. I wasn't sure where to go, away from the monsters and towards Fitz, or the opposite. The being sitting on the throne let out a deep, earth-quaking rumble. Fitz smiled at me calmly. The creatures slithered by me, but didn't seem interested in me. They surrounded the doctor, but didn't digest him like they had Dana. They encased him, fusing onto him like metal being welded together. Dr. Fitz changed again, this time more than mentally. His skin became darker, more like that of the thing on the throne. Shifting, yellow eyes littered his body, forming and reforming unceasingly. I could smell the hair and flesh being seared off of him. Whatever he was now, he was looking at me. He lifted his arm, pointing at me with a gnarled, shifting finger. Tendrils of black ink and bile rushed forward from his outstretched arm and pinned me to the wall by my shoulder. I cried out in pain. The force of the impact had dislocated my it. The thing that was once Dr. Fitz stared me down with his body of eyes. There was hatred in them, pure, unyielding rage towards not just me, but towards our species as a whole. He was disgusted by what he once was, and he yearned to be more than human once again. My clothes began to smoke and hiss. I felt a slight stinging, then burning. Then white-hot pain flooded every corner of my mind. My shoulders sizzled and bubbled. My clothes had been burned through, and layers of my skin were following suit. The feeling is something I don't like to relive. Imagine peeling off individual sticky notes from their stack. But instead of coming off neatly, the layers of my flesh slid away from my bones in an emulsified jelly. The intensity of the pain didn't stop, but its spreading did. Fitz's eyes had shifted from me to the entity behind it, still sitting on its throne of shadow and smoke. His tendrils retracted from me, and I collapsed to the floor. I could see my own connective tissue struggling to hold my useless arm to my torso. Fitz's 100 eyes shifted back and forth from me to the enthroned monster. His voice bubbled out of him, a raspy wheeze burying his old voice. "Go, tell them." I blacked out. When I came to, I was on the surface again, laying on the obsidian streets of the great city. Using the first aid kit in my bag, I did what I could to save my arm. The place once again seemed abandoned, but that gave me no comfort. After what I had seen, I knew this place only as hell on earth. I ran through the streets and out of the city. I went as quickly as I could up the mountain. Even injured, I must have halved our time from the original journey here. I didn't stop until I reached the base. I rambled to the workers about what had happened, but none of them understood or believed me. They rushed me to the medical center, where they, like I had, did what they could with the limited supplies we had. But I would need a real hospital in the near future. In the end, the loss of the other team members was chalked up to getting lost in the mountains. I was flown back to the country the next day, where I was treated at an actual hospital. With time and some skin grafts, they were able to save it. Months went by, and no one would believe my story. So I stopped telling it, and life carried on. I spent a lot of nights wondering about why I had been spared, why that thing took Dr. Fitz's mind but not mine. Writing this all down, I think I finally have an answer. It didn't take his mind. We weren't important enough for it to even notice us, let alone for it to consciously do something to us. The reason Dr. Fitz went mad and I didn't is simply because he happened to be a smarter insect than me. He was able to understand more than he should have. I believe he's still down there with it. Whether he's studying it or worshiping it, I don't know. I've started seeing him in my dreams, his twisted, morphing body and his thousands of eyes. The words he spoke echo in those dreams. Tell them. I'm not sure who he meant, but this is my attempt to fulfill his wishes. I don't want to find out what happens if the thing on the throne is displeased. Don't go looking for this place. There's nothing there for us but death. There's something pretending to be Elliot. I should clarify, I don't necessarily believe in ghosts. I honestly hadn't thought about Elliot in years. I'm not sure why I'm even writing this down, I just don't know what else to do. Our house is pretty old. It was built back in the early 1900s, but we've renovated since we moved here when I was young, about 20 years ago. So it's not creepy in any way, but we joke that it's haunted. I remember years ago, my sister claimed she saw a ghost. What do you mean? She shrugged, as if it was nothing. There was a little boy in a red shirt in the bathroom. I thought it was Charlie, so I told him to hurry up and get in the car, then he was gone. Charlie is my younger brother. She told me this about a decade ago, when he would have been around 5, and I remember being fascinated with the story. It feels a bit silly now, but I was 12, and a weird kid, so I went ghost hunting in my bathroom. I never found anything. Not surprising, as my only equipment was a toy net I had taken from some poor kid at school. I can't remember what I thought that would do against the ghost of a 5-year-old, but it made sense at the time. It was a few years before I thought about it again, when my younger sister Alana mentioned that she had seen the boy in the red shirt as well, although it was many years before she told me. It was never scary, just a fun story to tell to friends at a sleepover to freak them out, telling them the house was haunted. Still, it stuck with me. I decided to call him Elliot. It seemed to fit the short description I had, and the ghost story got more details the more I told it. A little boy named Elliot who lived in the house in 1920. He drowned in a mine nearby and still wanders around his old house a century later. I wonder if I created him. Neither of my sisters ever saw Elliot again. They said they never felt scared or in danger when they had, so I figured that if he was real, he was a harmless ghost that disappeared well over a decade ago. I got older, forgot about the haunted house story and the supposed sighting of this little boy, and life moved on. At least, I thought it did. A few weeks ago, the floorboards in the corner of my room creaked. This was nothing new. It was an old house and a windy night. There was bound to be some creepy noises. But something about this was different. My blood ran cold, and I thought my heart would explode, even if only for a split second. I didn't know why, but I just felt uncomfortable. Not knowing what else to do, I made my dog stay in my room with me and just went to bed. 2 days later, I had forgotten about it, until again I felt a deep sense of discomfort, of just general wrongness. I couldn't figure out what it was for a minute. Sitting at my desk on edge and listening for any noise, neck prickling, when I recognized it. Something was watching me. This happened for about a week. Every now and then I would feel it, the air would grow stale, the crickets go quiet, and I felt the now familiar uneasiness. When I told my friends, they claimed I was being haunted, telling me to move out, claiming they would never step foot in my house again. I'm sure many of you might say the same. Leave and never come back. But you have to understand my mindset at the time. This was the house I grew up in. I had never seen or heard anything wrong. The only unnatural thing that had happened in the 20 years of living here was the supposed sighting of a harmless 5-year-old ghost who had disappeared long ago. I was in my room. There was nothing scary about it any other time. Cheap fairy lights strung up and posters on the walls. A few moments of discomfort wasn't enough to send me running. Besides, I couldn't afford to move out. I was struggling through art school, living at my parents' house on a wage of 2 shifts a week at the news agency up the road. This wasn't a horror movie, just an odd feeling every now and then. After about a week and a half of the unsettling feelings becoming increasingly more common, I woke up at some time in the night while my dog growling at the corner of the room. I didn't think much of it, still half asleep, until I turned on the light to calm her down. There was someone hiding under the floorboards. I don't know how I knew. Nothing seemed to be there at all, yet somehow I could almost see it. It was big, and it was still, and it was watching me. I stayed on the couch for days after that, and every night I could feel it. Silent, hiding, watching. I felt awful. I couldn't sleep more than an hour at a time, couldn't shake the feeling, couldn't stop staring at my closed bedroom door. It was constant after that. Its eyes on me wherever I was in the house, and I jumped at every small noise around me, waiting for it to climb out of the floor and get me. I was beginning to think I was crazy, so I went to my doctor, explaining how I was being watched, shuddering just thinking about it. I'm not sure if it was the bags under my eyes or my frantic tone, but she spoke in long words about the effects of sleep deprivation and sent me home with a prescription for sleeping pills. I must have convinced myself it was only that, returned to my room that night feeling fine, took the pill and slept in my own bed for the first time in days. That night, for the first time, I saw it. My dog was growling from the door, and crouched in the corner was a crude attempt at a human form. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I just stared in horror at this thing in the corner. The arms and legs were too long, bent unnaturally to press itself down as flat as possible. It looked like a body fallen from a building, a broken form twisting its head back against the floor and staring with unblinking eyes. I don't know how long I sat petrified, unable to take my eyes off it. It might have been minutes, might have been hours, but I felt like I had spent days staring into those blank, empty eyes in the darkness. I don't know what happened next, if I had fallen asleep or fainted, but the sun was up and it was hidden again, watching motionless from under the floor. I left the room the second I could get my muscles moving again, mind racing as I tried to comprehend what the fuck I had seen. Had some malnourished hobo hidden away in my room while I avoided it? Was it some sleep paralysis from medication? I made my dad check the crawl space under my bedroom, leaving out the part about the humanoid creature. and he returned covered in dust and coughing. No one was there. No one had been there for ages. For the first time in years, I slept in my parents' room that night. They seemed confused when I asked, but set up a mattress with only a few concerned glances towards me. The light stayed on, my mum snored loudly, and it was in the corner again. It looked even more uncanny in the light. The skin was pale and stretched over limbs. Its face didn't fit quite right, like a mask with dead eyes. The clothes were dirty and too small. I could see ribs rise and fall too fast under a shrunken red shirt. It was trying to look like a child. Band-aids on the bony knees bent under its body, bruised rosy cheeks and missing front teeth. It was pretending to be Elliot. It didn't go away when the sun came up, when my parents got ready and went to work, when Charlie put a bowl of cereal next to my makeshift bed, when he replaced it hours later with lunch. It didn't look away. It didn't blink. It didn't leave. It stared from the corner with its mouth slightly open and its body contorted and pressed to the carpet. I didn't sleep, I didn't eat, I didn't look away, and neither did he. I was at the doctor's office. It was under the desk. I was in the car. It was in the back seat. People tried to speak me to me. It stared, it open-mouthed with a heaving chest and distorted face, this thing trying to look like a ghost boy I never saw, inching closer by the DA without moving a muscle. I don't know what it wants. I don't know what it is. I don't know how to make it go away. If anyone has experienced something similar to this, please help me. It's been weeks. It won't stop looking at me. I was a pickpocket in Delhi until I stole a wallet with something terrifying inside. My father named me Arav, so I would have a competitive advantage in life. He wanted me to appear at the top of class registers and government databases. He wanted me to be noticed, what I would give to never be noticed again. Anyhow, I'm aware that many Indian parents choose A names for children, but the point is that my parents wanted the best for me. Life doesn't ever go to plan, does it? Ma and Papa died in a car accident when I was 6 years old. That would have been awful enough, but then I found myself living on the streets rather than in an orphanage. Papa often told me that I had Lakshmi, goddess of wealth and fortune, on my side. Alas, it was a Lakshmi, the goddess of misfortune, who set her sights upon me. Or perhaps a Rakshasa, a demon. I used to tell myself that. Better the devil, you know. In truth, I don't know what I saw in that New Delhi slum, and the unknown terrifies me more than any nightmare detailed in religious texts. After my parents died, I sought escapism in Hindu mythology. I would pinch religious books from local libraries so as to feel some sort of connection to Ma and Papa. They had always been devout followers of the faith. I needed escapism not only from grief, but from life on the streets. I spent 3 years living with pickpockets between 6 and 12 years of age. They helped me to survive when I had nothing and no one. That feels eons ago now. I'm a 29-year-old software developer working in Paris. I often wonder whether I would have stayed in India had it not been for a horrifying experience, something which incentivized me to do whatever possible to get far, far away from the slums, the city, the country, heck, the continent. 2 decades later, I know that nowhere is far enough. The year was 2004, and I was a 9-year-old street urchin, an orphan who subsisted on rupees pilfered from Delhi's inhabitants. My group mostly targeted tourists, but it was an Indian businessman who caught my eye on this particular February morning. He looked displaced in the slums, like he'd strayed a little too far from Gurgaon's gentrified streets of glass and smog. Displaced fools are the best earners. The stranger was strolling stiffly, in odd, unnatural movements, along a cramped passageway of street stalls. He was a conspicuous man with a navy 3-piece suit, pristine black loafers, and an upper face shrouded by a black shawl. I remember being a little puzzled by his covered eyes. I wondered how he could see where he was walking. Of course, money was the main thing on my mind. Well, food, but money was necessary precursor to that. So it didn't matter that he was odd. It mattered only that he was important. And I knew that without a shadow of a doubt, as I'd spent 3 years perfecting the art of noticing important men. Of course, I wish I hadn't noticed him. I wish I hadn't swiped the leather wallet from the side pocket of his trousers. And I wish I hadn't seen it. In one of the wallet slots, below a healthy wad of green notes, was a Polaroid. Ordinarily, I would have pocketed half the cash, then returned the wallet to the victim's pocket. It's always best to stick to rupees. Wealthy folk often lose track of how many notes they carry, so they don't miss a few hundred rupees. Following this line of reasoning, my friends and I rarely aroused suspicion. I should have stuck to the plan. Should have taken the money, returned the wallet, and fled. But something about the white border of that Polaroid, brown-stained but poking tantalizingly out of the leather pouch, intrigued me, and I made the decision to let my finely tuned routine fall to the wayside. I let the businessman start to walk away. I broke all of the rules, and after I wiggled the photograph free, I whimpered, almost dropping both the wallet and the Polaroid. It was a picture of me, a picture that I didn't remember anyone taking, a picture of a place I'd never visited. There I stood, a boy with a blue tattered t-shirt, maroon-stained trousers, and bare feet. I was smudged a little, as if somebody taller had been standing in my place previously. And I was standing in a damp bedroom, with mold-ridden walls and upper bunks clinging to the two walls. The camera flash should have illuminated the entire space, given that it was such a small room. The room shouldn't and couldn't have been a large space. Yet it seemed unfathomably big. Too big for the light to reach the blackness beyond the bunk beds. I looked frightened. My head was starting to turn, and my brown pupils were crawling across the whites of my eyes, as if daring to look behind me, as if there were something I'd seen or heard in that unlit back end of the room. I trembled, fearfully scrunching the Polaroid in one hand and the wallet in the other. My instinct was to look up at the man I'd robbed, though I expected him to have left the vicinity. He hadn't. Standing motionlessly at the end of the dirt path ahead, like a rock bearing the crashing tide of impoverished marketgoers against it, was that wealthy, navy-suited businessman. He was facing away from me, and that deeply unsettled my gut more than the impossible Polaroid I'd discovered. Something was uneven about the way in which this man had paused in the middle of the path. Then he began to turn, began to pivot on loafers that seemed impossibly clean in contrast with the dirt beneath his feet. He twisted around until he was facing me directly, and I finally got a proper look at him. The black shawl still covered the man's upper face, but his lips still showed. They had transformed into subhuman features, had turned a muted gray, without even a hint of red, as if belonging to a corpse. The man's mouth neither smiled nor frowned. It simply started to open, and long strands of brown connected the upper and lower lips, gunky and thick, like rubbery mucus. Beyond the lips and the brown strands of unknown consistency was a black pit, an entrance that led to the man's gullet. Staring at it pained my eyes and left a quiver in my heart. The black seemed to be tugging my eyes towards it. I felt a strain in my retinas, felt my eyes start to bulge, and then the man started to take powerful strides towards me. I wanted to run. I still don't know why I didn't. He may have fixed me to the spot, with eyes or something worse hidden beneath that shawl. The man took angular strides towards me, with gray lips parting wider and wider to reveal a lightless cavity within, a version of hell ready to engulf me. However, moments before the gentleman came close enough to touch me, there sounded a harsh, braying honk. I spun to look at an impatient driver sitting in a green and yellow tuk-tuk, so I stumbled sideways to let the still-moving vehicle scoot past. But when I returned my gaze to the direction of the approaching businessman, he was gone. And the only remaining evidence, which convinced me that I hadn't imagined any of the horridness, was the damning Polaroid I'd crumpled in a teensy, quaking fist. When I arrived at the wooden shanty I called home, I was rebuked by one of the older boys for not returning the wallet to my victim's pocket. He said something along the lines of, "You just dropped a leather turd on our doorstep, Arav, and we don't shit where we eat." I was evicted, essentially, but that was the best thing to happen to me. It got me out of that hellish cycle, with nothing in my possession but a handful of rupees and a haunting photograph. A photograph that I dumped at the side of a road before leaving the slums behind. All I wanted was to leave India, run as far as I could for as long as I could. That impossible photograph left me feeling unsafe, left me feeling pursued. To leave, I needed money, so I pleaded with any and every business owner on the streets of New Delhi. A few unsavory sorts offered me work as a pickpocket, but I declined. I had to leave that life behind, and I didn't want to run into that suited spirit ever again. I was eventually blessed by a sweet couple who owned a restaurant in Connaught Place. They adopted me, and I was enrolled in a new school. I had just turned 10 years old, so I was about 4 years behind my classmates, but I eventually caught up. My goal, initially, was to get far away from the navy-suited man. The man with the photograph that made no sense to me. How did he know I would pick his pocket? I wondered. How did he create a photo of something that never happened? As the years went by, however, I lost sight of my goal. Lost sight of my superstitious fears. Lost sight of my religion. In 2014, at the age of 19, I believed that it had all been a dream, that I'd simply exaggerated events in my head. There had been no Polaroid. There had only been a string of traumatic events which had warped the mind and memories of a poor child. I no longer wanted to leave Delhi. I felt safe. That all changed on a late-night taxi ride. The driver released a series of expletives as his withered old tuk-tuk spluttered to an abrupt stop on a dirt road. We both stepped out of the rickety rickshaw to inspect the damage, but the driver shooed me off. "You'll only get in the way," he said. I rolled my eyes, but it made no difference to me. I remembered the slums at night. I felt comfortable there. In fact, I recognized the road. The ramshackle houses and empty market stalls looked different at night, but the street itself hadn't changed in the past decade. I had returned to my old pickpocketing grounds, but my stomach dropped when I saw it, crumpled up at the side of the road, exactly where I had dumped it 10 years earlier. I called it a coincidence, but I knew better. The photograph at my feet was that Polaroid from a decade earlier. I should have left it. I should have just kept my hands in my pockets until the taxi driver had fixed his tuk-tuk. Instead, I squatted and scooped the Polaroid out of the dirt. Then, using my phone's torch, I illuminated the picture in my weak, unwilling hands. What came from my lips next was a scream. I screamed not because this was the same photo from 10 years earlier, but because it wasn't the same photo at all. It was a new picture. A new picture of me. Gone was the young, frightened boy in the dark bedroom. In his place was a teenage version of Arav, standing at the side of a dirt road, next to a broken-down tuk-tuk, looking down at a mangled Polaroid in his hands. The scene depicted was impossible. The photograph had already been lying on the road, yet it depicted a scene that had yet to pass. I shot my eyes upwards, searching for the photographer who had to be standing at the other side of the road. However, as I eyeballed that spot, I saw only a black alleyway branching off from the dirt road, a road barely lit by a few sporadic lamps and string lights. Regardless, even with no light to reveal the passageway, I felt absolutely certain that something lurked in the dark. The taxi driver stirred me from my terrified trance, announcing that the tuk-tuk was operational once more. I didn't need to be told twice. I hopped into the vehicle and shrank into a fetal position, feeling vulnerable, exposed, as the vehicle, with no doors to provide even an illusion of safety, trundled slowly past the black alleyway. I was only a foot away from the spot in which the photographer must have stood, and I felt a wisp of wind wash over me as we drove past. With a shudder, I tossed the photograph out of the vehicle and vowed never to return to that street again. Vowed, as I had 10 years earlier, to leave India behind for good. Leave that man behind for good. I quit my porter role at the restaurant. My new ma and papa were sad to see me go, but they understood that I needed something better, not that they knew the full story. I found a job vacancy with a cruise line, and my hospitality experience helped me to secure the role. Out at sea, I'll be safe, I naively believed. It sounds silly, looking back. Silly to believe that this man with the power of premonitions would be unable to find me. I'd left India, and that, in my eyes, equaled safety. I would never return to that street in Delhi, so I would never return to my trauma. It all seemed logical. But when I was appointed to clean room 11 on the 3rd level, I started to suspect that I'd been wrong. As I walked down the corridor of rooms, I felt the graze of air against my nape, a gentle breeze that erected my hairs, though I chose to dismiss this warning sign. I didn't want to believe. The truth became undeniable, of course, when the door to 11 opened onto a black room with a crumpled Polaroid lying on the beige carpeted floor. My belly lurched downwards. For a moment, I thought the ship itself might have been sinking to the depths of the ocean, to the depths of hell, to a nightmare that had been awaiting me for a decade. I recognized that room, recognized the bunk beds clinging to the walls, recognized the darkness, not penetrated by my phone's torch beam, that seemed to harbor some hidden thing at the back of the bedroom. Yet again, I made the mistake of squatting and picking up that photograph. I resigned myself, in a way, to the fact that I was trapped, that I would never outrun this stalking monstrosity. And then I stumbled backwards as I faced a picture somewhat familiar. It was the very first photo I'd found in the wallet. Only that little boy wasn't so little anymore. He was a 19-year-old man, filling the blurry smudge that had been there a decade earlier. I was wearing that same haunted expression on my face. Was wearing those same doe-in-the-headlights eyes. It was as I'd always feared. The man was taunting me with prophecies. I thought I'd been changing my fate by running away, but I was always supposed to be in that room. On that ship. Not as a child, but as a young man. I was always going to end up in room 11. And something was always going to find me. Something at the back of the room. No, I realized, eyeing the picture. Something in the doorway, taking the photograph. I also realized at this moment that the breeze I'd felt on my neck had been no breeze at all. It had been an exhale of breath. Breath warm, stale, and wet. More liquid than gaseous. Don't turn around, I suddenly thought. If you turn, the prophecy in the photograph will come true. And you'll have to face what comes next. But I had to see. Had to see what was standing behind me in the doorway. What had exhaled warmly onto my skin. I slipped my phone out of my pocket and lifted it up. Then I gasped fearfully at the reflection in the black glass of my phone screen. Behind me there stood a figure in a familiar navy suit and a black shawl, which had been pulled back to reveal, well, I'm not sure. My eyes were straining again, you see, as if something were preventing them from seeing whatever was reflected in the screen. And with jittery hands, I dropped my phone to the floor. I almost turned around to see the man's face in full, but I reminded myself that I had the power to prevent the photograph from coming true. So I closed my eyes and started to back out of the room. Those hot, rancid exhales continued to beat in wretched puffs against my neck as I reversed out of the room. And then I bumped into something immovable. Something bolted to the carpeted hallway of the 3rd level. My shirt rubbed against the fabric of a blazer, producing an awful scratching noise. I felt like a child, safe as long as I kept my eyes closed. Somehow, that unsound logic rang true, as I eventually managed to sidestep free from the awful creature in the corridor. I ran blindly down the hallway, bumping into walls as I went, and only when I reached the end did I dare to open my eyes, simply to find the button for the lift. After that experience, I decided to return to land. There was no escaping that thing, but being trapped at sea made the nightmare infinitely worse. I felt stifled, claustrophobic. I spent the next few years in education, studying to become a software developer, and then I found a job in Paris, a gargantuan city with plenty of streets, plenty of places to run. For I will always be running. I know that now. Whenever I let my guard down, a crumpled Polaroid will always resurface to unveil some dreadful prophecy of a future that may come to pass. And I will try my best, every time, to make sure that it does not, because I don't know what will happen if it does. Is there any way to get a good night's sleep with your eyes open? My room is always dark, so it's perfect. I can't see anything until sunrise. Even then, I can get blackout curtains. I just can't sleep with my eyes closed. It's not an option. I can't stand seeing the other side. I should explain my situation from the top. Maybe someone out there can relate if it also happens to them. I doubt it, but it's a chance I'm willing to take. It started after a particularly stressful time in my life. I'd been running low on funds and couldn't find a place to live. My mother was generous enough to let me continue living at home while I worked 2 jobs to save money. I'm a high school teacher, but I also work at a local restaurant as a bartender on the weekends. I took every shift I could so I could start my life. I didn't want to be that teacher. that still lived with his mother. Didn't need to give the kids that much fuel to throw on my dumpster fire. That was until my mother passed away. It was unexpected. She ended up having a heart attack at work. The funeral was nice. I had my aunts and uncles help me with it. A lot of people showed up. My mother was a figurehead in our local community. People loved her. She couldn't walk 10 feet outside without someone calling her name to ask her how she's been or what she's been up to. She welcomed every single one of them with a smile. I'm sorry to ramble. It's just another straw on the camel's back. As awful as it sounds, it was kind of a relief. I was able to sell the house for what it was worth and got a good chunk of change to buy my own house close to the school and the bar. I thought that my stress would subside. Unfortunately, the previous stress was replaced with depression and even more stress. I had just lost my mother, who was my best friend in the whole world, and now I lived alone with no one by my side. Dating became hard for me, especially around this time. I'm not the most physically attractive man in the whole world, but I can work my way around a charming one-liner, joke, or funny story. I can usually pick up a guy or a gal when I'm working the bar, but those either lead to an uncomfortable one-night stand or one of us ghosting the other within a week. I will say it is mostly my fault. My continuous anxiety and depression rears its ugly head when I end up in situations like this. I don't have a reason why, it just seems to flare up when someone comes around that I'm fond of. It's truly a curse. Again though, not entirely important to what I want to say. Sorry, I really should just go to therapy instead of writing online. But here we are. I'm already too far into telling my life story to total strangers to stop now. Even if I did tell a therapist this, they'd lock my ass in a straitjacket, and I'm claustrophobic. Anyways, I lived at this new place for about 3 years. I'm still stressed and melancholic, but I am surviving and living comfortably. I still get frequent check-ins with my aunts and uncles over the phone. They all live down the coast, so I very rarely see them. About 4 months ago, I had my first incident with what's behind my eyelids. The first night it happened, it wasn't particularly noticeable. I ended up chaperoning homecoming that night and actually had a fun time with some of my coworkers. Encouraging kids to have fun tonight while also telling them to be responsible if they decided to make the poor decision of drinking underage. Although I knew they wouldn't listen. Yeah, Mr. Bryant, I'll be seeing you to grab one at the bar. One of my awkward underclassmen yelled as he was leaving. Please don't say that, I said, sounding overall defeated. My coworkers knew that I was a bartender, so I didn't have to vehemently defend myself. Thank goodness. We all laughed, and when the night finished, we said our goodbyes and drove off for the weekend. That week had been pretty tough for me. Just a lot of work that needed to be done. Not a ton of sleep through the week. I was actually so tired that I ended up driving on the wrong highway for about 20 minutes without realizing my mistake. I was just glad the weekend was here. I got home and immediately collapsed onto my bed. Didn't even get a bottle of water out of the fridge. I climbed into bed, shut off my light, and closed my eyes. As soon as my eyes shut, it wasn't the black void I was expecting. It looked like a hallway was just behind my eyelids. At first, I thought it was just the residue from the lamplight that was still burned into my retinas, but it lingered for far too long. The hallway was there, and it was lit up. I opened my eyes just to double-check that my bedside light wasn't actually on. Maybe I was so tired that I had just imagined that I had turned it off. The room was dark, pitch black. I decided that it was probably just a side effect of dealing with annoying-ass children all day and all night. I closed my eyes again. The gently illuminated hallway returned. I wanted to try and ignore it, but I couldn't help but look harder. I don't know how I looked harder per se, but it certainly felt like I did. When I did, I saw something at the very end of the hallway. It was faded, almost like it was being censored or blurred. Due to its amorphous shape, I couldn't make it out. My eyes opened and closed all night. The censored object started to become clearer. It just looked like the outline of a person. It was creepy, but it wasn't malicious. It was just someone in a hallway. I couldn't make out anything about them. It looked like someone giving an anonymous interview. You know when they're in that specific lighting? They didn't move. They didn't speak. It was a staring contest where the timer was the sunrise. I really did try to sleep and prayed that my mind would just shut off and ignore it, but I just laid in bed, retaining the feeling of my eyes being closed but not falling asleep. It felt like a 6-hour blink. I got no sleep that night. At least it was the weekend. I did have work late in the afternoon, though. I was hoping I could rest a little bit. I didn't take a nap all day. I very rarely take naps. It's just not how my body works. That's been true my whole life. So I went about my day physically exhausted. I didn't think about the hallway at all. I really had to get myself together, though, because I had to go to work. I arrived at work and was immediately met with sympathy from my boss, Justin. Justin was the owner of the restaurant. He was easily the hardest working man I've ever met. He didn't take shit from anyone and always had his employees' backs. When I applied for the job, he interviewed me, and after I made him a couple of drinks to try, he hired me on the spot. He knew going into the interview that I was a teacher too, and he still hired me for weekend shifts. It's truly a blessing to work for him, even if it's only part-time. Justin could tell that something was wrong immediately. "Hey Dex, you doing okay, man?" "Long night last night, sir. I chaperoned homecoming, and then I didn't get a second of sleep." "I'm just very tired," I said with a smile. I started checking the bottles behind the counter to see if we needed any refills from the back. Justin put his hand on the top of one of the bottles I was checking, pushing it back down onto the shelf. "Dexter, you should go home. You don't look well." "Sir, I'm okay, I can work," I said, trying to continue my work routine. "Dexter, I just watched you check the same bottle 3 times now. You're smoked. I can tell. I can work behind the counter this weekend. Take tonight off. Get some damn sleep. I'll call you in the morning to see how you are." I could tell that he wouldn't budge on this. I wanted to work because I needed the money, but how could I work either job if I got sick from exhaustion? I guess this was the right call. "Thank you, sir. I'm sorry if this is inconvenient," I said. "You're never an inconvenience, Dexter. You're one of my hardest workers. I need you at this bar, bud. I want you rested and healthy, and knock off that sir shit," Justin said with a laugh. I laughed and packed up my stuff. I thanked Justin again and drove back home. It was a rough drive, but my windows rolled down, AC blasted, and the cool autumn air was a combination that kept me awake and alert. When I got home, I made dinner, and by dinner I mean I had a bowl of cereal, and then went to bed. I laid on my side and closed my eyes. Everything seemed fine and back to normal. I saw a welcoming abyss and realized that I actually could get some sleep tonight. As I started to officially drift off, I shifted my body so I was laying on my back. I was met with a faint light and the figure from the previous night standing right in front of me. My eyes opened fast and I sat up in bed. My heart was racing and my breath was short. I didn't see the figure in full, but I saw that there were features on its face. I decided that it was once again exhausted paranoia and hesitantly closed my eyes again. It was still there. If it didn't look malicious the night before, it certainly did now. The figure itself was encased in a shroud of black. It looked like a shadow came to life, except somehow it was darker than that. The only thing that was different about the figure was its eyes. The eyes on the face of the black figure were piercing. They were the whitest white you've ever seen, with pupils that matched its shadowy exterior. I shot awake and got out of bed. It was only 11:42. I walked around my house for a minute to calm down. I got some water and went back to bed. I reluctantly went back to bed and built up courage to close my eyes again. The hallway light was dimmer, almost completely out. The only thing that could be seen at the far end of the hallway were the figure's eyes, steadily blinking and watching. I watched as it seemingly slowly nodded its head and turned away. Words suddenly appeared on the walls of the corridor. "It has to be you. See you soon." The hallway light went out with a very quiet flick of an unseen switch. I opened my eyes again. It was midnight. I wrote down what the walls said on a notepad I had on my bedside table and stared at the ceiling for a while. I contemplated going back to sleep. What would be waiting for me on the other side of my eyelids? I decided to just see what would happen and fearfully shut my eyes. I saw nothing. I mean, it was an outline of a hallway in the dark, but there wasn't anything in there. I breathed a sigh of relief and was able to officially fall asleep. For the last 4 months, it's been just that, a dark hallway in my vision while I sleep. It's eerie, but I've been able to ignore it altogether. I'm writing to you now. People have read it looking for advice because the last couple days have been challenging. The light in the hallway has been flickering occasionally. As of last night, they've turned on fully. They are bright and foreboding. I don't want to risk what comes next. If someone can figure out a good way to sleep with your eyes open, please let me know. I can't keep living in fear of closing my eyes. The house my father built. I need to get this out before it's too late. I've been sitting on it for weeks, pacing my apartment, the hardwood creaking under my socks, the radiator hissing like a cornered cat. My hands shake as I type, the laptop's glow stinging my bloodshot eyes. I haven't slept in days, not since I went back to that place. If you're reading this, don't judge me too quick, just listen. Maybe you'll know what it means. Maybe you'll tell me how to stop hearing the walls. It started when my dad died last fall, October 17th, 2024 to be exact, 2 days after my 29th birthday. Lung cancer took him fast, a chain smoker's grim finale. He was 63, wiry and gray, with hands like sandpaper from decades swinging hammers. He'd been a carpenter, the kind who could turn a pile of splintered oak into a dining table you'd swear was art. His last call came from hospice, voice raspy over the crackling line. "Jenna, the house is yours. Don't sell it blind. Check it first." I didn't think much of it then. He'd built that place himself, a squat 2-story cabin on 12 acres north of Saranac Lake, New York, tucked in the Adirondacks where the pines choke out the sun. I figured he meant termites or a leaky roof. I was wrong. I drove up 3 weeks later, November 8th, a Friday. The air was sharp, smelling of wet leaves and frost, the kind that stings your nose and fogs your breath. My old Subaru crunched over the gravel drive, headlights slicing through the dusk to catch the house crouched against a wall of trees. It looked smaller than I remembered. Sagging porch, cedar siding weathered to a dull gray, windows like dark eyes smudged with grime. The chimney puffed lazy smoke. I'd paid a neighbor, old Mr. Gentry, to light the wood stove before I got there. Inside, the place was a time capsule. Plaid couch with cigarette burns, a rotary phone on the wall, Dad's toolbox by the hearth, rusted pliers, a claw hammer, nails scattered like teeth. The air hung heavy with dust and the faint tang of mildew, the floorboards groaning under my boots. I dropped my duffel by the stairs, narrow, steep, carpeted in faded maroon, and started a fire. The logs snapped, spitting embers that danced up the flue, casting jittery shadows on the pine-paneled walls. I'd brought a thermos of coffee, black and bitter, and poured it into one of Dad's chipped mugs, the one with "World's Okayest Carpenter" in peeling letters. That's when I noticed the hum, low, steady, like a fridge compressor but deeper, vibrating in my chest. I checked the kitchen, empty fridge, unplugged, then the basement door, a slab of unpainted oak by the pantry. The hum pulsed louder there, seeping through the wood. I jiggled the knob, locked. Dad never locked it when I was a kid. I shrugged it off, too tired to hunt for a key, and crashed on the couch, the fire's crackle lulling me under. I woke to scratching, not loud, soft, deliberate like fingernails on drywall. My eyes snapped open, the room dim, fire down to glowing coals. The digital clock on the mantel blinked 3:14 a.m., its red digits fuzzy in the dark. The scratching came from upstairs, a slow drag, then a pause, then again. Scritch, scritch, stop. I sat up, blanket slipping to the floor, my breath shallow and quick. The house was old, sure, mice, wind, settling beams. But this felt wrong, too rhythmic. I grabbed the fireplace poker, cold iron biting my palm, and crept to the stairs. The maroon carpet muffled my steps, but each creak of the wood underneath spiked my pulse. The air grew colder as I climbed, a draft licking my bare arms, smelling faintly of damp earth and something sour, like spoiled milk. At the top, a hallway stretched left and right, 5 doors total, 3 bedrooms, a bathroom, and a closet. The scratching came from Dad's room, second on the right. The door was ajar, hinges squeaking as I nudged it open with the poker's tip. Moonlight spilled through the single window, its frame warped, glass streaked with years of rain. The room was sparse, twin bed with a sagging mattress, a dresser topped with a cracked mirror, a rug frayed to threads. The scratching stopped the second I crossed the threshold, silence so thick it pressed on my ears. Then I saw it, the wall by the bed. A patch of plaster, maybe 2 feet wide, was scored with thin, jagged lines, dozens of them, crisscrossing like a kid's chaotic sketch. They weren't there last time I'd visited, 2 years back. I touched one, tracing the groove. It was deep, fresh, plaster dust crumbling under my fingertip. A thud jolted me, heavy, deliberate from below. I spun, poker raised, heart hammering against my ribs. The hum was back, louder, rolling up through the floorboards like a growl. I bolted downstairs, boots slipping on the last step, and froze. The basement door stood wide open, a black rectangle exhaling cold, musty air. The lock dangled, broken, its screws glinting on the floor. I hadn't touched it. I edged closer, poker trembling in my grip, and peered down. A wooden staircase descended into shadow, each step warped and splintered, the hum now a steady drone that buzzed in my skull. I should have left. Every nerve screamed to grab my keys and run, but Dad's voice echoed. Check it first. I flicked the light switch by the door. Nothing. My phone's flashlight cut a thin beam, catching cobwebs and dust motes as I took the first step. The wood sagged under my weight, creaking like a warning. The air thickened as I went, damp, metallic, with that sour edge stronger now, sticking in my throat. At the bottom, the basement sprawled, a concrete box lit only by my shaking light. Shelves lined one wall, stuffed with mason jars, cloudy, unlabeled, their contents sloshing as I passed. A workbench sat opposite, strewn with tools. A handsaw, chisels, a mallet crusted with something dark. The hum pulsed from the far corner, where a tarp draped over a lumpy shape stained and frayed at the edges. I yanked the tarp back. Underneath was a wooden hatch, crude and uneven, nailed into the concrete with thick, rusted spikes. The hum poured from it, vibrating the floor, and with it came a sound, low, wet, like someone sucking air through a clogged straw. My stomach twisted. I pried at the hatch with the poker, nails screeching as they gave. The wood lifted, revealing a hole, rough, hand-dug, maybe 3 feet wide, dropping into blackness. The smell hit me hard, rot, copper, and that sour milk stench so thick I gagged. My light caught something down there, a glint, then movement, a slow, jerking shift, like a limb flexing. I stumbled back, dropping the poker with a clang. The hum spiked, a deafening roar, and the walls, God, the walls started to breathe. The pine panels flexed, bulging out then sucking in, splintering at the seams. Dust rained from the ceiling, and that wet sound grew, gurgling, gasping, closer. I scrambled upstairs, slamming the basement door, and jammed the couch against it. The whole house shook, windows rattling, the floor bucking like a living thing. I grabbed my duffel, keys jangling, and ran for the car. The Subaru roared to life, tires spinning gravel as I floored it, the cabin shrinking in the rear view. But I heard it, one last time, clear as a bell through the chaos. Jenna. My name rasped from the dark. I've been back in Albany since, 200 miles south, but it's not far enough. The hum followed me. It's faint at first, nights only, seeping from my apartment walls. I've checked the studs, the pipes, even tore out drywall. Nothing. My neighbor, Mrs. Platt, bangs on the ceiling when it gets loud, her broom thumping like a judge's gavel. Last week, I woke to scratches on my bedroom wall. Thin, jagged, just like Dad's room. The mirror fogged up yesterday. No steam, no heat, and something pressed against it. A handprint, too big, fingers splayed and webbed. I smashed it, glass slicing my knuckles, blood dripping on the carpet. Last night was worse. The hum turned to words, mine, warped and slow, like a tape played backward. Jenna, come back. I recorded it, phone trembling, and played it for my friend Mark. He heard static, nothing else. I hear it clear as day. The walls here flex now, just a twitch, but it's growing. My landlord's coming tomorrow, eviction notice pinned to my door, yellow paper curling at the edges. I don't care. I'm going back to the cabin tonight. Not to stay, to burn it. Gasoline's in my trunk, matches in my pocket. Dad built that house, but something's in it. Something he locked away, or fed. If I don't stop it, it'll keep coming. If you've seen this, heard it, tell me. What did he build down there? What's calling me? I'll check this post before I go, signal permitting. If I don't reply, don't come looking. I'm an urban explorer. I've just discovered the US government's biggest secret. I don't care what anyone says, 12,000 subscribers is a big deal. If I asked you how many you know who you can call friends, You might say maybe 8 or 9. The amount of people who truly care about what you have to say is probably even less than that. I, on the other hand, have thousands of fans catching every new episode with fervor and praising me habitually in the comments. It started off as just a hobby, and I suppose it still is. I do plan on quitting my job at Target, though, as soon as the channel really starts bringing in enough money. It started off with prank videos, funny animals, and dicking around with friends. Anything I thought might get the views pouring in. I didn't think my big break would be the shaky GoPro footage of me and Josh crawling around the abandoned trailer park on the edge of our hometown. Josh, by the way, was my channel's co-creator. He was also my brother, but the less said about that, the better. Since that first taste of success, my channel became dedicated to urban exploring. Josh and I would take our van around the state, trespassing on abandoned yet still often private property. We filmed in old hospitals, apartment blocks, schools, that sort of thing. If we didn't find anything too interesting, sometimes we'd reshoot a few scenes with a twist and add a supernatural element. As safe as this formula was, things were starting to get stale. The last couple of videos were getting maybe a few hundred views each, and we were running out of interesting enough places to explore. The problem was our budget, or a lack thereof. We could barely afford respiratory masks to combat the constant patches of black mold we stumble across. To be able to travel to some of the most breathtaking locations, even within the country, felt like a distant dream. This is why the email felt like a godsend. I was throwing a quick eye over junk mail, checking if anything important had slipped through before I deleted it all. That's when I saw it. The guy's name was a jumbled bunch of letters and numbers, as was their Gmail account. What really caught my eye was the subject heading, "Interesting location." I clicked on it, expecting to find another suggestion for a great place to film, which then ends up being in Bulgaria or some other Eastern European country. Instead, the email was composed of a quick little message to me, followed by a set of coordinates. "Hi Hal Explorers, big fan of the channel. I've been watching you for a year and I love what you do. I wanted to share a location with you. I found it recently, inside past a cave mouth. Again, I love your channel. Please keep it up." I got the impression from the message that English wasn't their first language, which didn't give me much hope. Regardless, I copied the coordinates he included and pasted them into Google Maps. The pin dropped down 5 miles from my house. I immediately rang Josh and told him to get his stuff ready. A day later, we had all the equipment we could muster and a bag full of provisions, mainly pastrami sandwiches and Gatorade. On top of that, we had a flashlight, hex set, some semblance of a first aid kit, a length of rope, a piece of chalk, and a spare flashlight. So far, we've never used the rope for anything, but I find it helps with the professional image. It was during the drive to the location that I thought maybe we should have checked it out beforehand, just to make sure that it was worthwhile. Then again, even if it did turn out to be a dud, it's not like we wasted any gas money at this close of a distance. We drove into the forest, and then the dirt path pittered out. We parked up and grabbed our stuff. Now, I know the area. I spent most of my childhood exploring these woods. I knew there weren't any abandoned structures in the area, but what I did know was around is caves. My mother warned me extensively never to go near it. Carved into the sloping face of a small hill was the dark entrance to a cave system. Following the map on my phone, it took 20 minutes of walking to get from the path to the entrance. The first thing I noticed was a scattering of crumpled up beer cans and broken bottles. I feared that whenever treasure was down there had only been desecrated, but I carried on. "You know, Mom told us to never go near this place," Josh said abruptly. "Josh," I said, shining my torch in his face, "you're 24. What do you care what Mom says?" "Nah, it's not that. It's just she really didn't like us playing out here, you know? I don't think we even saw this place, and she was still warning us." I crouched at the entrance and shone my light into the shadows. The cave went on another few meters and then stopped short of anything interesting. I took a few steps towards and saw that there was a thin opening near the back. Bingo. I grabbed the bag and moved forward. "I think a school friend of Mom's went missing here when she was young," I said to Josh, goading him in. "That's why she was so paranoid." Josh tentatively followed me deeper in. The thin opening was only a little wider than my forearm. It was a tight squeeze, but I reckoned I could make it. I faced my torch towards the opening and saw that the ground underneath looked firm and only around 2 meters down. "Okay, Josh, start filming," I said as I took the rope from my bag. I tied a random Boy Scout knot around my waist and through the other end of the cord jet a shot. Josh held the small camera in front of him and gave me the thumbs up. I winked at the camera and threw my bag down the opening. Josh immediately stopped recording. "Wait, you're actually going down?" he asked, genuinely concerned. "Sure we are. And don't stop recording," I said as I threw my legs forward and fell down into the opening. A slight graze was the worst of it. I grabbed my bag and shouted for Josh to come down. I picked up my torch and illuminated the area around me. I had fallen into a small cavernous chamber. I could hear the faint dripping of water from stalactites, and at the edge of the chamber was a hole, brutalized into the rock face. I walked over to it as Josh began to shimmy down the crack. "Hey Josh, I think I found something," I said, casting the beam of my light down the tunnel. Josh landed gruffly and picked up his bag and equipment and walked over to my side. With a sigh, he followed me into the tunnel. It carried on for a few yards before leading into another chamber. We repeated our maneuver of dropping the supplies in first before crawling in ourselves. This cavern was slopped and uneven. With only one direction to go, we continued descending forward. Dishearteningly, we came to a dead end. We dropped the bags again and looked at each other. "Maybe it's a dud," Josh suggested. Probably. I had high hopes, though," I said as I took a sip from my water bottle and leaned against the wall. I felt some sharp dig into my side. "What the fuck?" I muttered to myself, turning around. I shone my torch towards where I'd been leaning. Sticking out from the wall was a metal door handle. I looked at Josh to make sure he was filming, then back at the handle. It was barely noticeable, covered in rust and sediment. I tried it. It creaked and grinded against some equally rusty internal mechanism. I pulled back and watched as a large rectangular section of the wall swung open. I turned to Josh, a look of pure glee plastered across my face as I pumped out some spiel for the video, hyping up our discovery. I talked to the camera as I walked into the unknowably long, uniform concrete tunnel that lay on the other side of the door. The metal door, whether on purpose or due to the sheer process of time, was covered in sediment which blended it into the cave walls. As we entered the corridor, Josh made sure to leave marks of chalk on the wall. With most buildings, it was never too hard to find your way out again. This place, however, was shaping up to be a real maze. I wouldn't have been shocked if we came across a minotaur. It was pitch black, pure darkness, other than the weak beams of our torches. My only worry was the footage quality as Josh and I descended further into the tunnel. It snaked sharply left and right, but never split into more than one continuous path. The walls were dry and gray. Other than the occasional stain, they were completely bare. I'd stopped talking now, letting Josh film me traversing the corridor from behind. After a few minutes of walking, we turned a corner that ended in another door. Once he arrived at it, I realized that I was the exact same as the first we'd come through, only without the obvious aging. It was metal, robust, and covered in a thick layer of dust. Looked like it hadn't been budged in a decade. I let Josh squeeze past me, which was difficult in the cramped quarters, and get a close-up of the door. Once he had, I told him to open it. Wordlessly, he did. We entered a small, white-tiled room with rusting shower heads lining the walls. Through another identical door, we came into what looked like a locker room. Hanging all around us were jumpsuits and masks, all made from the same rubber-like material, all a dull amber in color. Josh filmed me taking one of the dust-covered masks down from the wall. I held it in front of my face and made a reference to an obscure video game. Before moving out of the room, I hung the mask back up. There was an old urban explorer motto, "Take only pictures, leave only footprints." I followed it most of the time. Behind the next iron door was a flight of stairs descending even further. The steps were concrete and scattered with once sodden, now bone-dry papers. I held the torch level as we walked down them. The hand railing was rusted, and the fluorescent light bulbs overhead were shattered. I felt the broken glass crunch under my boots as I neared the bottom. The stairs ended in a lobby that wouldn't have looked out of place in a medical institution. I walked out over 2 double doors that lay on the ground, covered in debris. Shining the light around, I saw that there were 3 different passageways leading off from this main room. Josh was filming the rows of old, tattered seats as I walked towards the map painted onto the far wall. It had a helpful orange square with "You are here" written next to it. In white paint, it outlined the structure's layout. If it was accurate, then this place was truly massive. I called Josh over. "What did you find?" he asked, poising the camcorder. "I think it's a diagram of this place," I told him, my finger following the map's trails. Josh zoomed in as I noticed the symbol key. Dotted around the map were small denotations. I matched them with the key, trying to figure out which rooms were being shown. Canteen, bunkhouse, recreational facility, breaching room? Josh took more footage while I read through the list of functions, which were printed out on a fading piece of laminate attached to a hanging clipboard. I got to the end and saw that we were on floor 1 of 9. "Holy shit, this place is huge," I muttered. "What do you think this is anyway?" Josh asked. I turned to him, but looked directly at the camera when I answered. "Well, of course we don't know, but my best guess would be some sort of nuclear facility. Maybe a decommissioned bunker, something along those lines. You know, the government rarely told us where they built these things, so it wouldn't be all that crazy." Once the scene had exhausted itself, I took a picture of the old map on my phone and we moved on. The place was an absolute gold mine. It was like a mix between a Soviet weapons silo and an old hospital. We left marks on the Libertine halls to help with the last case scenario of getting lost. I felt more confident now with a map, but we couldn't take any chances. Every single surface was covered in grit and grime. I could see the particles dance and shift within my torch's beam. As I walked down these abandoned halls, ducking into every room without a locked door, I couldn't believe that no one else had come across this place before. I was excited. This felt like the big break my channel needed, and Josh was recording every second of it. Most of the first floor was rooms full of stacked beds. The bunkhouse, where the workers would have slept and, I imagine, spent most of their time. I couldn't help but wonder what they were doing down here. I sat on the edge of one of the beds and pulled out a locked box from underneath. It was heavy and made from a solid leather. After a while of trying, I realized that I couldn't open it with brute strength and kicked it back under the bed. As I stood, I realized every bed had a similar locked box underneath. I tried a few more, all with the same issue. I shrugged at the camera and left the room. After walking around the first floor for a few minutes more, we came across another stairwell. I motioned to the camera to follow me down as I grabbed the rotting wooden handrail and descended further into the facility. 2 turns later, the stairs ended in a narrow corridor. Countless doors, most of them locked, were dotted along the walls. I tried to peer through the small windows on the doors whenever they had one, but something covered each of them from the other side. This floor, the second floor, was a maze in every sense of the word. Josh filmed me taking a dozen corners, left, right, until we came to another small foyer. I sat on one of the decomposing chairs and tied my shoelace. I shivered as a cool breeze caressed my neck. Judging from Josh's reaction, he felt the same thing. I looked around for a vent, but didn't see one. I stood up and kept moving. We pushed through a series of hanging plastic sheets and, on the other side, were greeted with another door leading into another stairwell. I took out my phone to check my picture of the map and realized that it only showed the layout of the first floor. I smiled when I realized my error and made a joke about my intelligence, or a lack thereof, to the camera. I put my phone back in my pocket and opened the door. Halfway down this flight of stairs was an overturned desk and 2 chairs. I crouched and opened the small drawers on the overturned desks. A few pens fell out, nothing of note. I climbed over the obstacles and then took the camera from Josh so he could do the same. Once we were on the other side, I turned and dramatically kicked the double doors open, making a movie reference as I went. There was a door directly to the left of where we came into. We ignored it for now, instead walking to the end of the snubbed corridor. There were 2 doors and a sign containing 2 arrows, one pointing towards the bathrooms and the other towards a dining hall. "Well, I am feeling pretty hungry," I said to the camera, rubbing my stomach. I cringed soon after and made a mental note to cut that. Through the swinging doors and into the canteen, we were greeted by the largest room we'd seen yet. It must have had the floor space of a football pitch or two, and the rows of benches blurred into a mirage the further on they went. I'd like to remind you at this point that we were in total, absolute darkness, other than what light our handheld torches threw out. As we ambled through the hall, it was a wonder we didn't trip over anything. A small glint caught my eye, and I sat down on one of the sterile, blue-gray plastic benches. Josh stood next to me and filmed, close up, what had lured me over. I admit I thought it was a coin or maybe a hunk of jewelry. Instead, it was a piece of foil wrapper. I picked it up and looked more closely. It was a packet of apple-flavored chewing gum, with one bit left. If this is what they were eating down here, no wonder the place is abandoned. "Look at all these E numbers," I said, holding the wrapper up to the camera. I stood and we began walking over to the kitchen. As we did, I kept repeating the joke I made in my head, over and over. I realized it didn't make sense, as people don't exactly eat chewing gum, but I didn't feel like reshooting anything either. We kept moving towards the kitchen, and as we did, the smell got worse. Once we'd hopped the counter and actually gone into the area where they kept the now long-since rotten food, the smell became too much to handle. Josh retreated, burying his nose in his elbow. I persevered long enough to peek into the freezer. Its preserving cold had long since faded, and the meat that once hung in there was now a stale black puddle. I gagged and rushed out. Josh filmed me hopping the counter, and we started to walk back to the door we came through. I stopped, noticing something hanging on one of the white, concrete pillars. It was a calendar. I walked over to it and beckoned Josh to do the same. It was left open on March, and every day before the 27th was marked with a red X. I flipped it to the front and saw that it was for the year 2009. We took plenty of footage of my discovery, and I espoused my theory, in a more serious tone, that this must have been when the place became abandoned. After we were done filming, we decided to sit at one of the benches and eat. If you're wondering, I had a pastrami sandwich and a Dr. Pepper. Satiated, we exited the hall. As soon as we entered the hall, I turned left. "Don't you want to film in the toilets?" Josh asked, tugging at my shoulder. "I'm sure there'll be more around the lower levels. We can film in them." "I want to keep powering forward," I said, "and besides, we just ate. I don't want to go gawk over some fossilized, decade-old human shit." Josh shrank back, and we arrived at the door next to the one we came in. It was yet another staircase that we followed down to the 4th floor. As soon as we reached that floor, I knew we'd hit the jackpot. It was like some of the abandoned hospitals we'd seen on steroids. Long, medical white halls were littered in rusting, decaying equipment. Scalpels and other tools were strewn everywhere. A patientless IV drip stood at the end of the first hall like a ghost. I had Josh focus on the bloodied, bunched-up sheets that blockaded a doorway while I snooped around one of the accessible rooms. Inside was what looked like a dentist chair, only it had a large iron trepan dangling from the ceiling above. I felt like a kid in a sweet shop as I looked through all the cupboards and drawers, finding dozens of files and even more cobweb-covered equipment. Among the rubbish, I found a pizza box-sized silver container. It opened with a click, and inside I found a stack of microfiche. I may have been born after the millennium, but I still knew what they were. I didn't see a microfiche reader anyway in the room, so I walked back out onto the halls. I suddenly had what I thought was a great idea and held the film in front of my face. I held my torch on the other side and shined it towards me. Instead of illuminating the imprinted images, I momentarily blinded myself. I laughed at my own stupidity and leaned against a wall, rubbing my eyes. Then I heard Josh call me. I followed the sound of his voice past another stairwell entry and around the corridor's bend. He was standing with his camera in front of a giant, obstructive pile of dirt that came down from a portion of collapsed ceiling. Realizing there was no way through, I doubled back and made my way to the door we'd come through. Looking around, I realized there was no other passageway apart from the one we'd already explored. Nor did any of the unlocked rooms have a second door. Cursing, I found Josh again. "There's no other way onto the rest of the floor," I told him, although he'd already come to the same conclusion. With a sense of defeat, we left what had been by far the most interesting and promising section of the facility and carried on down to the filth floor. We didn't stay for long. A pipe had obviously burst somewhere, and the ground was covered in a few inches of grimy brown water. We tried to navigate our way by hopping from one rotting wooden panel to another. A few gave way under our weight, and by the time we'd reached the door out of there, our shoes and socks were drenched. Not that I was paying much attention, but I reckoned that most of the rooms in that section were being used for storage. We quickly opened the door and closed it, only letting in a small torrent of water which accompanied us down the steps in the form of a fast trickle. The room we came into was promising, as it had a similar medical flair as the fourth floor. We almost turned left when I noticed the symbol on the door to our right. I approached it, my cameraman close behind, and saw that on the door was the silhouette of a rabbit, depicted in red paint. With a strange sense of unease, I grabbed the door handle and barged into the next room. It looked like an interrogation room. From where we were, we could see through the one-way mirror. There was a long mahogany desk covered in what looked like radio equipment. Half a dozen swivel chairs surrounded us. It looked like the production control room at this TV studio I once interned at. In the blank room beyond the mirror was a chair. No desk, just a lone chair facing us. I noticed there was no door between this room and the blank room, nor was there any door at all leading into the blank room. We ducked out and continued on through the left side door. Jackpot again. It was almost a carbon copy of the fourth floor, except it was strangely carpeted. The thin maroon carpet was caked in dust and dragged my eyes away from the otherwise white walls. The first room I entered, luckily, had just what I was looking for. A magnifying glass. Not exactly a microfiche reader, but I suppose it wouldn't have worked with electricity anyway. I took the crumpled strip of images from my pocket and held them to the magnifier, handing my torch to Josh. The images were grotesque. I was holding 98 tiny pictures of conjoined twins, each connected at the head. The pictures were all taken from various angles, and nearer the end of the rows, various levels of decomposition. The very last image on the slide showed a botched attempt to separate the pair. I gagged and dropped the microfiche. "What is it?" Josh asked dumbly as I stormed past him. He followed me into the hall where I slumped against a wall and slowly edged down onto the floor. Josh loomed over me. "Stop recording," I said, and he did. He sat next to me and comforted me, not knowing exactly what had gotten me so worked up. In myself, I knew it wasn't just the photos. I was starting to let the sterile monotony of this place get to me. "Do you want to turn back around?" Josh asked. "I think we have enough footage." I smiled. "It's fine, I want to keep going. I just need a break," I said. He nodded and patted my shoulder. He stood, leaving the recorder next to me, and he walked into one of the rooms. I absent-mindedly began to caress the scar along my abdomen, left over from the less-than-professional operation that separated me and Josh soon after birth. Josh came back out of the room soon after, holding a fading binder of documents. Now, I was never good at math, or academia in general, but I could recognize the symbol on the front of the binder as the symbol of pi, only turned upside down. "Interesting read?" I asked in earnest. Josh didn't reply and kept looking at the documents intently. Before I could say anything else, he began to read aloud. Subject Aleph shows signs of successful tether realignment. He has answered 42 of the 45 questions of the Clem assessment accurately, while displaying little distress. He has continued to develop Tab's hobbies and interests since his brother's disassembling. Dr. Redacted has reported contact with Tab, although this is an impossibility. Aleph expresses connection to the Red Rabbit, furthering evidence of tether realignment. I grow increasingly confused the more Josh reads out. "What does any of that mean?" I finally asked him. "Who knows?" Josh replied, thumbing through the remaining documents. He closes it and reads out the message stamped on the front. "Property of the Red Rabbit Group," he says, then posits his theory. "My money is still on weird government shit. God knows what they've been doing behind the public's back." I stand, brushing the ceiling flakes from my trousers. I put a hand on Josh's shoulder and looked him in the eyes. God doesn't have anything to do with this, I said, and then, actually, do you mind if we do this all again on film? After that, we walked down the dark halls with a newfound unease. I didn't want to admit that I was scared, but I also couldn't imagine what could be inside some of those rooms. Something more terrifying than any boogeyman, no doubt. Man's curiosity. We turned a corner and saw someone, or at least that's what we thought, while our hearts beat out of our chests. Fixing our torches on it, we saw that it was a suit. Looking closer, we saw that it was made of rubber and covered in straps. It looked like a gimp suit, we realized, and it was hanging down from the ceiling, its collar caught around a broken strip light. I hope you didn't shit yourselves, I said, looking at the camera from over my shoulder. I went over to the hanging suit and nudged it. It swung back and forth, creaking as it did. The closer I got to it, the more the smell of vinegar overpowered me. I backed away from it and bumped into Josh, who had turned his and the camera's attention to the burn marks on the door to our left. We pushed through it and descended into the 7th floor. The first thing we see is a skeleton. Laying, facing the ceiling, was a bleached human skeleton, dressed in a coral gray suit. My brother and I immediately freaked out, and I dropped my flashlight, the bulb shattering. Josh handed me the camera, and he approached the apparent body. He knelt by it, strangely calm, then laughed. "It's plastic, don't worry," he said, grinning. "Probably a lab dummy." Now in the role of cameraman, I recorded my brother's interaction with the faux skeleton. He grabbed the skull, and with a little elbow grease, it came off. He stood up, quoted Shakespeare, then punted the skull down the hall. We laughed, and I set the camera down. Josh held the light over me while I hunted through my bag for the spare torch. I found it, and we carried on. The first room we entered clearly used to be some sort of operating theater. We walked past the rows of wooden seats which were arranged like a small sporting area around a white stain-covered hospital bed. The room gave me a bad feeling, so we quickly walked past the bed and out of the door on the far side. We came into yet another identical hall. Shining my light, I saw that there was an old wheelchair and a T-junction at one end of the hall, and at the other end was a door with the same red silhouette of a rabbit. We paced towards the rabbit door, which we found, unfortunately, to be locked. Kicking bits of concrete out of the way, we turned to walk up the passageway. We filled the place with artificial light and saw, to our horror, that the wheelchair was gone. "What the fuck?" Josh said. Admittedly, he noticed it first. "What?" I asked, concerned. "What's wrong? Wasn't there a wheelchair right there a second ago?" He pointed out. I stood still for a moment, mulling over his question. I quickly realized he was right. Against our better judgment, we tentatively approached the end of the hall. Josh filmed me creeping around the T-junction, and that's when I saw it. A few meters down the corridor was the wheelchair. I looked back at the camera as I slinked towards it. It was rusted beyond repair, and the wheels appeared buckled. I took a step forward and saw what was laying on the seat. I find it difficult to describe. It was covered in a similar material to the suit we'd seen hanging the floor above, only it didn't have any straps, or any seams at all, for that matter. It was just a black box with a weird sphere resting on top. The sphere had what looked like a metal funnel embedded into the front. Only the tube was a snub, barely 2 centimeters long. Dangling from it was a small length of string. I took it in my hand and tried to yank it off, but it just kept on coming. I felt like a kid trying to pull a loose thread from his cardigan, only to unravel the whole thing. The string that was being pulled out was stained black and wet. Josh came and stood next to me, filming what was going on. Suddenly, he retracted the camera and gasped. I looked around, unsure what got to him. "What's wrong, man?" I asked. That's, he stuttered, pointing at the thing slumped on the wheelchair, a torso. At that, I looked back at the slumped object and studied it. Admittedly, I could see what he meant. It did kind of look like a person with their arms and legs stripped away, but that was impossible. Josh was about to speak again when suddenly, I felt a debilitating pain wash over my forehead, then my entire skull. I fell against a nearby wall, an exposed pipe digging into my back, but that pain was nothing compared to the hum in my brain. I gripped my teeth so hard I thought they'd shatter and looked at my brother from behind my hands, which clawed at my face. From his reaction, I could tell he was feeling the same thing. I dropped my flashlight to the ground, and its beam illuminated Josh. I couldn't see his light, nor the thing in the wheelchair, which was now plunged into darkness. The pain reached such an unbearable peak that thoughts of suicide briefly crossed my mind, and then, as quickly as it came on, it went. I stumbled to Josh and helped him to his feet. He held each other, still shaking and sweating, tears welling in our eyes. As we began to collect ourselves, we heard a voice, not from anywhere around us but from deep inside our own minds. "My name is Dagaz." I picked my torch up and looked around. Its light fell on the figure sitting in the wheelchair. It suddenly looked a whole lot more human. "Have you seen Ansu's?" A tinny voice echoed in my mind again. "What?" whispered Josh. I realized that he was hearing it as well. Suddenly the wheelchair rolled forward, as if pushed by an unseen nurse. "Ansu's." The voice repeated itself as the wheelchair drew near. Now I was certain that thing was its source. The names Ansu's and Dagaz repeated themselves in my mind. They carried an odd familiarity. I reached my hand into my pocket and pulled out the now crumpled microfiche. In the dimming light I saw what was written in black pen just above the rows of images. Brothers Ansu's and Dagaz, pre-post-op. I looked up at the thing on the wheelchair and realized that it was, indeed, human. I extended my arm and handed the microfiche to him. It began to float out of my hand and hover in front of Dagaz. It slowly rotated and then fell to the floor, released from his mental grasp. As he was completely covered, I couldn't have possibly realized how much of a rage he went into when he saw the photos. I only noticed when Josh dropped to his knees. I watched in terror as Josh, tears streaming from his eyes, grabbed a large piece of concrete that had been chipped away from the walls. He begged and pleaded with Dagaz as he lifted the block above his own head and brought it crashing down. I realized what was going on and dropped to my brother's side. I wrapped my arms around his, trying to get him to stop, but they moved with a strength that wasn't his own. Muscles popped and veins burst as he kept driving the stone block into his head, again and again. I fell backwards and stared as Josh's head turned to mush. There was no way he was still alive, yet his arms kept moving, kept grinding his own skull into a fine pulp. Finally, he lowered the now red chunk of concrete. His arms returned to their side, and he didn't stir again. As soon as I heard the creak of that wheelchair move toward me, I bolted. Screaming, the flashlight in my hand bounced up and down as I ran. This distorted my view, and is likely why I didn't see the mesh of pipes and plastic in front of me. I ran directly onto it, and it gave out from under me. I plunged down the hole and fell against the hard rock of the 8th floor. I'd landed on my arm and the torch. Both were now broken. In complete pitch blackness, I stood up. I clutched my shattered arm and limped forwards, still content on getting away from Dagaz. I walked into a wall and realized I had to calm myself and be careful. The next, by my best guess, 4 hours was spent crawling around the 8th floor in total darkness. I was feeling along the walls, trying to find a doorway that led to stairs going up. I had no such luck, although my hands were now cut up from dragging them against the jagged surroundings. Another hour into my hopeless wandering, I saw it. A tiny red dot, just ahead of me. I cautiously put one foot in front of the other and made my way towards it. I bent down and reached out. My hand touched Josh's camera, which was still wet with his blood. I recoiled as I realized its implication. I'd left it where it was, by my brother's body. How did it end up down here? The possibilities all chilled me to my core. Regardless, out of necessity, I picked up the camcorder. After some fiddling, I managed to switch on the night vision mode. I held it to my eye and looked around. The walls were covered in paintings of red rabbits. All around me, swirling into a bizarre mural. I'd been walking among them for hours. The floor was covered in bits of cloth and broken furniture, which had kept me on uneasy footing since I fell down here. I crept over them as I carried on my search for the stairwell door, now in a world of grainy, artificial green. The next corridor I turned into ended in a wheelchair. I squinted and saw that it was moving forward. It was Dagaz. I turned and tried to run, but my exhausted body wouldn't let me. I turned left, then right, limping down a hall I didn't think I'd been down before. I realized too late that if the door at the end of the hall was locked, then I was in a dead end. I turned to see Degas roll around the edge of the passageway, cornering me. I backed up against the door and turned the handle. It swung, and I was greeted with the 9th floor. Hundreds, maybe even thousands of skeletal bodies lined the floor. Really, there was no 9th floor. Every installation had been ripped away, apart from the first few steps of the staircase, creating a giant cavern of death. It felt like staring into the deepest pit of hell. Fist clenched, I shuffled around to look at Degas. He was directly in front of me. The string from his muzzle began to lift into the air. I didn't want the same fate as Josh. I took a step back. The last thing I remembered from that day was falling. I woke up an unknowable amount of time later. It took me a while to realize that I was laying on the grass amongst a scattering of beer cans. I was in the middle of the woods, right outside of the cave entrance. It was bright out, only a little after noon. I walked and didn't stop walking until I reached the road. I'd been gone for 17 days. In that time, Josh and I had been reported missing. The police had carried out a search, but found nothing. The day before I turned up, it'd been called off. My family were overjoyed to have me back, but the pain felt of losing Josh was immeasurable. I told the cops what happened as best I could. I'm not sure how much of my story they believed, but they did bring me with them to find the door at the bottom of the caves. They never did. After that, my story was essentially discredited. It was at this time that I began to dream of a red rabbit. It would dance around me in a meadow and try to lead me into the forest. I never followed it. A week later, I finally found some time to myself. I slumped on the bed of my childhood room, as I've been staying with my parents since I returned. After a nap, I sat up in bed and realized that I hadn't opened the bag I brought with me. I grabbed it, unzipped it, and emptied out its contents. It had a few things we'd brought left in it. Unfortunately, my camera was never found. One last thing fell out when I gave it an extra shake. A document. I realized that Josh must have shoved it in there and didn't live long enough to tell me. I sat down and for the past few hours read all the way through it. The US government sanctioned all of this. They've been experimenting on victims of craniopagus. I still don't know how long this has been going on, but the founder of the Red Rabbit Group, Hans Klemme, was brought to America from Germany in 1947. They were studying some form of telekinesis or telepathy or something. I need to write more. I have to write more. But I've just looked outside of my window and realized that the same black van that was parked across the street this morning is still there. Please read it. Get the message out. Whether it's the man in the trench coat knocking on the front door, or the increasing pain I feel along my now oddly fresh and raw separation scar, I don't think I'll be around for much longer. Just a mosquito bite. Elizabeth, what did you think of the Amazon rainforest exploration? I asked, trying to break the silence. It was the best experience I've ever had, Giovanni. I never imagined there were so many incredible animals. But, she paused, frowning. The only thing I didn't like was the mosquitoes. There are so many here in Brazil, it's impossible to escape them. Ah, those damn mosquitoes, I replied with a bitter laugh, leaning down to scratch my foot. Not even repellent gets rid of these pests. He looked at his foot and saw the red mark itching like fire. He was already covered in bites, but this one felt different. It was bigger, more swollen, and throbbed as if something were pulsing inside. Are you leaving today, Elizabeth? I asked, still scratching the wound, feeling a burning sensation that only got worse. Yes, why, Giovanni? She asked, flashing that smile that seemed straight out of a dream. Her blonde hair framed a perfect face, almost unbelievably beautiful. Elizabeth was unlike any other foreigner I'd ever met. There was something about her, something special. She seemed to glow. And me, well, I think I was in love. What happened last night doesn't mean anything to you. I dared to ask, my voice almost breaking. Elizabeth let out a soft laugh, tilting her head gracefully. Oh, Giovanni, I can't believe you took that seriously. It was just one night, sweetie. She held my face with her cold, delicate fingers. Then she stepped back, walking toward the Uber that would take her to the Manaus airport. From there, she would fly back to the United States, leaving me behind. "Bye, sweetie," she said, with that English accent that made my head spin. I stood there for a moment, watching the car disappear into the distance. I sighed. Deep down, I knew this was inevitable, but I couldn't shake the feeling of loss. Elizabeth was like a comet passing through my life. While driving through the streets of Manaus on my way home, my thoughts were still on her. But I was soon dragged back to reality by the damn itch. My foot burned like fire. I had to rub my heel against the car mat as I drove. When I finally got home, I lay in bed that night, still thinking about Elizabeth. The way she smiled, her scent, it was as if everything about her had been designed to enchant me. But the itch, oh, the itch, it just wouldn't stop. I spent hours trying to sleep, but I couldn't. My fingers kept scratching the skin on my heel, but nothing eased the sensation. The mark, once just a mosquito bite, now looked redder, harder. Around 3 in the morning, I finally gave up on sleep. I got up and went to the bathroom. I grabbed a bottle of alcohol and poured it directly onto the wound, hoping it would help. Damn allergy, I muttered angrily, as the burning sensation crawled up my leg. Looking into the mirror, I saw sweat dripping down my face while the cold liquid brought momentary relief. The next morning, I woke up to find the bite even bigger, as if a small ball were growing on my foot. I ran my hand over the wound and felt its texture, hard, inflamed, almost hot. The itch, oh my God, the itch. You have no idea. It was as if that little bump was the very fire of hell trapped beneath my skin. I poured more alcohol on it. It brought some relief. But as I tried to get ready for work, I noticed something was different. The wound throbbed, and the burning sensation was now accompanied by sharp stings that came and went, like tiny electric shocks. I'm a tour guide, helping tourists discover what they can and can't do in the Amazon. That's how I met Elizabeth. I got to work, but the discomfort was unbearable. The stings kept getting worse. At first, they felt like mild shocks, then like deep needle pricks. By the time I made it back home that night, my foot felt like it was on fire. The small bump I had noticed that morning had grown. A lot. I considered going to the doctor, but the thought of spending the whole day at the hospital, only to be told it was just a tropical allergy, discouraged me. If it gets worse, I'll go tomorrow, I told myself, trying to sound convincing. That night, the pain intensified. The stabbing sensation felt like it was reaching the bone. It was horrible, like something was biting my flesh from the inside. I ran my hand over the wound and felt the hard texture, almost as if there was something solid under the skin. My heart froze when I noticed a slight movement. Something was alive in there. A goddamn botfly. I muttered, my voice trembling. Everyone's heard stories about botflies, flies that lay their eggs under the skin, with larvae growing and feeding on flesh. But this felt different. I grabbed some tweezers and alcohol, went to the bathroom, and sat on the floor. I looked up at the shower above me, the dark glass of the shower stall reflecting the dim bathroom light. Through the window, I saw the pitch-black night, the moon hanging like a silent witness. I pressed around the swollen area. A sharp pain exploded, like needles stabbing straight into my foot. I kept pressing, even as tears rolled down my face. The wound started turning purple, with dark edges. And then it burst. The smell that came out of it was indescribable. A stench of rot mixed with something worse, like death itself. The bathroom filled with the reek, making my stomach churn. From the hole, tiny larvae began crawling out, thousands of them, wriggling over my foot. I doused them in alcohol while screaming, watching them squirm and drop to the floor. But there was a bigger one. I grabbed it with the tweezers, and when I squeezed it to kill it, the smell intensified. I felt nauseous but kept cleaning. The itching stopped for a moment, but the hole in my foot was now enormous, exposing red muscle and thin, necrotic tissue along the edges. I saw something white. Bone. I moved my big toe and watched the bone shift inside the wound. My whole body trembled. I nearly passed out right there. After hours of trying to clean it, I wrapped the wound in bandages and applied ointment. In the following days, I kept working, but the smell worsened. Even with fresh bandages, the stench of rot seemed to seep through everything. People began to notice. Tourists complained. Flies started appearing, drawn to my leg. Eventually, my supervisor had enough. He fired me, saying it was impossible to keep a tour guide who reeked of death. At home, I peeled back the bandage in the bathroom. The smell that escaped nearly made me vomit. It was horrible, a stench of decay, like sewage mixed with rotting meat. I stepped back, holding my breath, but I had to look. In the center of the hole, something was moving. Larvae, small and white, began crawling out, writhing across my skin like worms on a corpse. I poured alcohol on them. The smell grew worse, as if the larvae released even more rot when touched by the liquid. Some died immediately. Others fled, crawling across the bathroom floor. I grabbed the tweezers and pulled out a larger one. When I squeezed it, it burst between my fingers, releasing a black, viscous liquid that smelled like pure sewage. I rebandaged the hole and went back to bed, trying to ignore the stench, now clinging to every corner of my house. But in the following days, things became unbearable. The bandage, which I changed daily, became soaked with a yellowish-green liquid oozing from the wound. It started attracting flies, dozens of them, not just one or two. They constantly hovered around my foot, trying to get under the bandage. Their buzzing drove me insane. They seemed to know exactly where the smell was coming from. But that night, when I got home, the wound revealed just how bad things had become. As I removed the bandage, now yellowed and stiff with pus, I was hit by the most horrible smell I had ever experienced. It was like feces mixed with rotting meat. The wound had spread across my heel, with blackened edges and exposed flesh. Tiny muscles pulsed at the edges and in the center. Worms. Thousands of them. Some were dead, dried out by the alcohol, but many were still moving, crawling over the raw flesh. I poured more alcohol. The liquid soaked into the open wound, and the pain was so unbearable that I collapsed to my knees. I watched as the larvae writhed, some trying to escape, while others simply died, releasing a greenish liquid. From deep within the wound, something larger emerged. A thick, white worm with red spots. It crawled out slowly, as if reluctant to leave its shelter. I grabbed it with the tweezers and crushed it. Flies swarmed the bathroom as I tried to clean the mess. They wouldn't stop circling the wound. Some even tried to land directly inside the open hole. I tried to shoo them away, but it was useless. That night, I lay down with my body exhausted and my mind in pieces, but I couldn't rest. The itching came back, this time on my head. I reached up and felt something hard and swollen, a new wound. When I woke up, the wound on my foot was wide open. The smell, worse than ever. I ordered an Uber. I couldn't drive. The driver clearly noticed the smell but said nothing. And the flies. My God, the flies. Thousands of them, trying to burrow into the wound, swarming over the fresh bandages I had barely managed to put on. When I arrived at the hospital, the scene was the same as always, an endless line. The public hospital system never disappoints. I went straight to the nurse. I need help. It's an emergency. She barely looked up at me. We can't let just anyone in. There are children, women, and elderly people ahead of you. That fat bitch spoke like I was there for fun. You think anyone comes to this hellhole because they like it? I thought, but swallowed the words. I really need help. I think I'm losing my foot. She sighed, as if my presence was a personal offense. Let me see. She left the triage area, acting like some kind of savior. It wasn't even her job to look at wounds, but one glance was enough. She didn't even need to get close. The smell of rot coming from my foot hit her like a punch in the face. The bandage was infested. Flies buzzed everywhere, starving. The bandages? I could hardly look at them. Soaked, heavy, stained with a dark brown and greenish hue, like something rotting from the inside. Some parts had hardened into a disgusting crust, while others were pure liquid, slowly dripping. The flies danced in circles around my foot. Hundreds, no, thousands of them. Some landed, walking with those filthy legs over the damp fabric. Others forcing their way into the gaps between the loose gauze. One fly went straight for the nurse's face. She swatted it away in panic. Go in! Jesus! How did you let it get this bad? Disgusting. She spoke to me like I was a mangy dog, as if my existence itself was offensive. I swallowed the lump in my throat, only because I didn't have the strength to argue. Like I said, no one comes to a public hospital like this unless they're desperate. The endless lines, the unbearable heat, and the staff who treat you worse than garbage. Shoo, the woman, fat, around 30, stormed off, huffing like I'd committed a crime. She complained loudly, her mocking tone making it seem like everything was my fault. I was there, begging for help, and she acted like I was the worst human being on earth. I had never felt so humiliated. When she reached the entrance, she stopped to whisper to a colleague. I saw them glance back at me with disgust. The other nurse pinched her nose, and I heard her say, "Gross. How does someone let it get that bad?" My blood boiled. I couldn't take it anymore. "If no one helps me, I'll sue all of you for human rights violations." My voice cracked. I was crying now. Tears streamed down my face, while people nearby looked at me with disgust. Some covered their mouths and noses, trying to escape the stench spreading through the air. That suffocating heat of Manaus, combined with the hellish atmosphere of the public hospital, made it feel like I had shit my pants. Finally, after 20 minutes of humiliation and judgmental stares, a nurse appeared. She called me into the emergency ward. I dragged myself there, feeling the weight of everyone's eyes burning into my back. I entered the examination room and sat on the bed. The nurse, young, with her hair pulled tightly into a bun, tried to maintain professionalism, but I could see it on her face. Disgust. "What happened to you?" she asked cautiously, approaching as if handling a ticking time bomb. "Giovanni. My name is Giovanni." I spoke softly, scratching my head without realizing it. The automatic gesture reminded me of another problem, dandruff. I was probably covered in it. I placed my hand on my head as if that would somehow make me look less miserable. It started with a damn mosquito bite. I thought it was a botfly, but it turned into this. I pointed to my foot. She looked, and I saw her face twitch as she tried not to react to the smell. I couldn't blame her. The gauze was worse now, practically dissolving in pus and blood. "Do you have a history of diabetes?" she asked, her voice nearly indifferent, but still keeping her distance, as if I were contagious. "No, never had." "We'll run a test." She grabbed the equipment and worked quickly, avoiding any unnecessary contact. When the result came in, negative for diabetes. Before she could say more, the doctor entered the room. Tall, thin, wearing a white coat completely unsuitable for the suffocating heat. He stepped in, but the smell hit him immediately. I saw the exact moment he stopped, hand flying to cover his nose as he muttered, "Holy God, what the hell is this?" Even with his hand partially covering his nose, he had to take a step back when he saw my foot. The wound was now completely open like a bottomless pit. The edges were blackened and shriveled as though burned. Pus slowly oozed out, mixing with old blood. In the middle of it all, the larvae. Some were small and fast, burrowing deeper, searching for more flesh. Others, however, were massive, the size of thumbs. They twisted slowly, seemingly satisfied, fat from devouring what was left of my foot. The gauze I had applied earlier was soaked and falling apart, dissolving into pieces. Flies still buzzed, drawn to the wound, some landing on the decomposing tissue clumped at the edges. The doctor forced himself to look. He leaned in, examining the wound's details, discomfort painted across his face. When he saw what was happening along the edges, he lost some of his composure. "I think we'll have to cut it off." Those words hit me like a punch. My heart pounded. My vision blurred. I looked at my leg, at what was left of it. I could see the black patch crawling upward. "We're sedating you now. This is urgent." That was the last thing I heard before everything went dark. "What the hell is this? Have you ever seen anything like this before, nurse?" The nurse, pale and visibly disgusted, answered curtly, "You're the doctor. You should know." He shook his head, sweating beneath his mask, muttering almost to himself, "Never in my life have I seen an infestation like this. The worms. Damn, I swear one of them is bigger than my dick." The doctor tried to compose himself. They positioned Giovanni's leg and began the procedure. They had decided to amputate the part infested by the larvae. The smell was unbearable, something so foul it seemed to cling to the air, invading noses, throats, and stomachs. The nurse couldn't take it. She took 2 steps back and vomited against the wall, clutching it for balance. The doctor took a deep breath and started with a small incision, trying to minimize the damage. But as soon as the surgical blade touched the flesh, everything collapsed. The decayed flesh simply gave way, like a sack bursting open. Worms, fat, slick, and squirming, spilled out onto the floor. They buzzed and writhed as though being set free. Some, enormous, crawled across the floor like snakes. Others squirmed mid-air, spreading the putrid stench further throughout the room. "My God," the doctor murmured, feeling his stomach churn. "This is worse than anything I've ever seen." The larvae were unbelievably large, some as long as fingers, others even bigger. Every time the doctor tried to cut away more dead tissue, it seemed as though the worms emerged from the flesh on their own. When the leg was finally amputated, the doctor paused, glancing at the rest of Giovanni's body. That's when he noticed something that left him even more horrified. "Nurse, look at this." On his head. She hesitated but couldn't ignore him. When the doctor pushed back Giovanni's hair, both of them recoiled at the same time. Among the strands of hair, thousands of tiny larvae writhed, moving together like worms feeding on a corpse, a living, pulsating mass. Every time the doctor pushed back more hair, more larvae fell, some small, others already growing, clinging to the scalp. "Holy God," the nurse muttered, trembling as she tried to stay professional. The doctor took a deep breath, but when he looked behind Giovanni's ear, he broke down. The tissue around the ear had been completely devoured. Flesh was gone, revealing the white of the skull, which the worms were slowly eating away. He couldn't hold it together. The smell, the sight, everything made him vomit right there, doubled over the sink. "We don't have a surgeon for this. We need a second opinion, fast. There's no way I can handle this here." But he knew there wasn't time. Reluctantly, he moved closer to Giovanni's head, the nurse beside him clutching a used vomit bag. With gloved fingers, he pushed aside hair matted with sweat and dirt. Thousands of tiny larvae began spilling onto the floor, flowing like a living wave. They were different from the massive ones that had emerged from the leg, small but just as active, wriggling in every direction as if searching for more flesh. When he began using the scalpel and surgical saw, the dead flesh around the skull slid off almost on its own, disintegrating like wet paper. As he made the incision and lifted the top of the skull, the inside was crawling with worms. Thousands, maybe millions, moved among the folds of the brain, already partially devoured. The larger larvae were monstrous, nearly the size of small snakes, gliding lazily. The smaller ones moved quickly, devouring lymphates. The smell that escaped was indescribable. The doctor and nurse recoiled at the same time, coughing and gagging. This is pure sewage," gasped the nurse, tears welling in her eyes from the stench. The doctor tried to grab one of the larger worms, but it slipped through his gloved fingers, slick and slimy, falling to the floor with a wet plop. When he looked again, he realized he could feel the brain pulsating through the glove. The worms were moving with such intensity that the entire organ seemed to throb. "He's not dead, but he's done for." The nurse vomited again, collapsing beside the examination table. As she stumbled back, she slipped on something, the mixture of blood, pus, and larvae now covering the floor. "Nurse, clean this up," the doctor shouted, trying to regain control. "That's not my job," she screamed back, voice thick with disgust and desperation. "Clean it now, or I'll call your supervisor." "Clean it." Trembling, she obeyed. The doctor grabbed the phone in the next room, dialing the disease control center in Manaus. "This is something I've never seen before. We've got an urgent case. Worms. I don't even know how to describe it. Just get here." They promised to arrive by 3 p.m. As the doctor returned to the operating room, he heard the nurse screaming. She had been trying to clean the larvae off the floor, but they seemed to move too fast, clinging to her gloves and crawling up her arms. The doctor knew this was just the beginning. He looked at Giovanni's body, still breathing, though there wasn't much left to save. "Mommy, my arm itches. I'll put some ointment on it after school, sweetheart." "Okay, Mommy." I took Caio's hand and we headed toward the car. As we walked, something caught my eye. Giovanni's house. It had been empty for days. The windows were shut. Everything looked abandoned. What could have happened to him? I wondered, but I quickly shifted my focus back to Caio, who had started whining again. When I got into the car to take Caio to school, I noticed something unusual through the window. A group of military personnel had arrived at Giovanni's house. There was strange activity. Their truck blocked half the street. My stomach tightened, but I ignored it and continued with our routine. "Mommy, my arm hurts. It feels like something's biting me." I glanced at Caio quickly. He was scratching his arm furiously. The skin looked slightly red. "It's just an itch, baby. It'll go away. We'll put some ointment on when you get back from school." I tried to reassure him, but as I spoke, I felt a strange itch on my own leg. Discreetly, I placed my hand on my thigh and felt it. A small, hard bump. A bite, maybe. Probably just an allergy. Nothing to worry about. I looked at Kaio again in the rearview mirror. He kept scratching his arm, relentlessly. I should have listened to my coworker. First off, if you see this and you are my boss or coworkers, no, you didn't. Rest assured, all names and identifying information of participants will be changed in accordance with HIPAA. But I have to document what's been happening to me for my own mental health, and I don't particularly want to talk to HR about it. Anyway, let's start from the beginning. My name is Marcus. I'm a 26-year-old nobody who just landed a new job as a DSP, a direct support provider, or a caretaker of sorts. I got fed up with working in the retail rat race and decided to pivot into nursing-adjacent occupations. Somehow I landed a job with a local, well-known disability advocate agency. I would be working in one of their total care homes overnight. My job duties are overwhelmingly simple: cleaning the house, doing laundry, and assisting the participants when they need to get up and use the restroom. Occasionally, I'd need to help them shower and get into or out of bed, but it's surprisingly easy to get people into pajamas or day clothes when you get showed the tricks of the trade. Participants is what I'm legally supposed to call the people that live here. And the total care part of Total Care Home means that everyone who lives here in this building are wheelchair bound and require help with most activities in their daily lives. That's the care that my coworkers and I provide to give disabled people a somewhat normal and comfortable life. And I'm quite proud to be a part of this agency, helping those who need it. The first month of my job was all training, 2 weeks of very boring classes at the head office, and 2 weeks of in-home training with the overnight worker I was replacing. His name was Teal. Weird name, I know, but I kind of like it. Teal was moving to work daytime hours in the house and was giving me the rundown of what to do, who everyone was, the things they liked, and their usual nighttime routines. The house supported 10 people, 5 men and 5 women. However, there were only 4 women living here when I started, as the 5th resident recently passed away. Her name was Nancy, and she loved to finger paint. Some of her things were still in her room, waiting for her family to collect them. So I looked through her dresser and found some of her paintings the first night I was there. There were a lot of handprint turkeys and cute little thumbprint bumblebees on cute little hand flowers. Some cards the other participants made as a form of grief management were on her bed, and I was told her window blinds stayed open because she liked to be able to see outside, and it made everyone feel better to see out that window when they passed by her old room. I quickly got into the swing of things, and the 2 weeks of training went by very fast. Teal taught me more of the job, how some of the participants are fall risks, meaning they don't have the strength to hold themselves upright and could fall out of bed if they tried to get up on their own. Why it was so important for me to do 2-hour checks on all the participants and to investigate any noises in case somebody had fallen. The last day of training, Teal and I were sitting at a table in the house kitchen, doing our own things to pass the time, when he said that there was something he had to tell me about working overnights. He went on to describe how the house sometimes creaked in ways and from places that didn't make sense, or how the shadows seemed to take humanoid shapes in your peripheral vision, that the activity had gotten more common since Nancy's passing, and how sometimes he swears he can see hands on door frames that move quickly out of view. I'm not one to be spooked by the paranormal. I have a bit of a moist, poetical view of ghosts. I want to believe they are real, but have never encountered anything that I could reasonably attribute to ghosts before. So I shook off his stories. I'd worked plenty of graveyard shifts, and no matter where I'd worked, everywhere seemed to have their own ghost stories. It's been 3 months since that day, and until yesterday, I'd not encountered anything even remotely paranormal. It was 11:20 p.m., and I had just finished my bi-hourly checks of everyone, and all were sound asleep, with all TVs and radios off. An eerie quiet set in after I sat back down at the kitchen table, the only sound being the creak followed by low hum of the central heating turning on and off, and the only light being a single fluorescent bulb above my laptop and chair. The house was a giant V shape, one hallway housing the men's rooms, and one hallway with the women's, with 2 bathrooms on each side. In the middle of the house where I sat was a combination kitchen and living room. We had a few storage closets to fill out the space, but from the outside the building looked like a giant square. Because of this, sound tended to echo, and I tried to be very quiet while doing my nightly routines, as to not wake anyone up while cleaning or checking on their neighbors. At the kitchen table, I was working on some required training for a certification I needed to continue working here. In the middle of note-taking, I heard a decently loud ker-thunk echo down from the women's hallway. I assumed Elizabeth had fallen out of bed again and went to check up on her, but she was still tucked safely into bed in the same position I had left her in 20 minutes prior. Okay, I thought, must have been Abigail? But again, no. Abby was exactly as I had left her. I checked everyone's rooms after that. Both Charlotte and Pam were also in bed, and nothing seemed to be out of the ordinary. It was strange, but not uncommon to hear weird on-off noises in the night. I chalked it up to the house settling or the cold outside and sat back down at my laptop to continue studying. Not 5 minutes went by before I heard the ker-thunk sound again. Out of obligation, I got up to investigate, made sure everyone was still asleep and that nothing in their rooms had fallen over. This time, I even checked the windows to make sure they were closed and locked, but could find no discernible source of the noise. I even took a peek inside Nancy's old room, since her door was open, to make sure that nothing in there had fallen over, but everything looked fine, so I closed the door behind me. I sat back down, telling myself that perhaps the wind had picked up outside, and that, coupled with the extremely low late winter temperatures, was causing some weird noises. When the noise happened a third time, I ignored it. But something tells me that whatever made the noise didn't like that very much, because the fourth time it happened, it went from a decent ker-thunk to a startlingly loud ka-chunk. The house seemed to still after that noise. The central heating had turned off, and even the hum of the fluorescent lighting above me was quiet. I waited a moment, half expecting to hear someone calling for help from their room, and half waiting for the air in the room to not feel so cold again. I sighed very loudly, masking my rising anxiety with annoyance, and got up from my computer, making the rounds again. I was worried somebody might be trying to break in at this point and were being very unsneaky about it. This time, I also checking the men's rooms to make sure I wasn't mishearing where the noise was coming from. Nothing out of the ordinary. No people or objects on the floor that could make a noise that loud, and nobody outside anyone's windows. It had been almost 40 minutes of strange noises, checking and rechecking rooms, that I decided that I needed a break. Everything was annoyingly fine, and I was getting into my own head about what this noise was. I pulled my phone out, scrolling the local news for a bit while I made myself some lunch. A grilled cheese and some juice in hand, I sat back down at my laptop to read an article about proposed city ordinance changes. I quickly finished my lunch, but spent maybe an hour or so losing time to one article after another, so lost in my own little bubble that I almost didn't hear the soft ker-thunk directly behind me. I froze, and something inside of me told me not to turn around, not to look behind me. A feeling of dread rising as I heard a series of small ker-thunks like stomping, labored footsteps heading away from me and echoing down the women's hallway. I waited, unmoving, until the only sound I could hear was the low hum of the light overhead. After that, I decided that the lights needed to be on the rest of the night. All the lights with no exceptions. Hallway, kitchen, bathroom, didn't matter. All on. I also played some music from my phone on a low volume and did anything and everything to distract myself from what I thought had just happened. The noises didn't continue the rest of the night, and I was starting to calm down enough to rationalize that perhaps I had really freaked myself out and that everything was fine. 2 more bi-hourly checks went by without any more occurrences, and before I knew it, I was on my last round of checks before I headed home for the morning. I checked the men first, then Elizabeth, Abigail, Charlotte, and Pam. I shut Pam's door behind me, mentally preparing myself to drive home and get some sleep before I come back tonight, and noticed that across the hallway, Nancy's door was slightly ajar. I did close that door earlier, and my morning coworkers had just arrived 5 minutes ago, and were still in the kitchen. The feeling from earlier came back, something inside me saying not to peek inside her room. But I did anyway. I pushed the door open and walked inside. Everything was exactly where it had been left hours ago, except the window, where there was the faint outline of a handprint. I got a closer look. It wasn't uncommon for there to be passerby in the night, and perhaps somebody had put their hand up to the window to look inside since the blinds were up. That had to be it. Somebody was outside last night, maybe trying to case the home through the windows, and left an identifying mark on the window where they looked inside. Only, the handprint was on the inner pane of glass, not the outer one. Whoever made this handprint did it from inside the house. Surely this wasn't here earlier? It was faint, but I still spotted it right away. I would have seen it earlier. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I had an idea. I grabbed one of Nancy's paintings from her dresser and held it up to the window. It was a near-perfect match. I heard one of my coworkers calling for me, so I placed the painting back into the dresser and tried my hardest to push this whole evening to the farthest corners of my mind. I went home that morning, played a few rounds of video games, and went to sleep. I won't lie and say it was hard to fall asleep. It's hard to feel scared when the sun is peeking through your curtains. But it was hard coming back to work the next day, after dreaming about that kerthunk that has now buried itself deep into my brain. I keep catching my roommate standing alone in the dark, and I think he's been following me. Me and my roommate have known each other for a couple years now. We met through my financial advisor in college, as I really needed a new place to live. And she knew of another guy who attended school as well and needed a place to live. I met Sam at a coffee shop one day, and we got along pretty well. We had enough similarities and decided to give it a shot. The first 2 years were great, we got along well and had different friend groups. We both did our jobs to keep the place clean and paid up and gave each other enough space to never butt heads. Sam was all right. That is, until one day we had a rather big argument as he accused me of sneaking into his room at night. He claimed that he caught me walking around his room going through his things, leaving out of the window once I was caught. I was dumbfounded at this accusation and had just assumed something happened in his life and he wanted out of the house. The next day when I got back home, I was fully prepared to have to explain to the landlord what had happened with Sam, hoping he could maybe help find me a new roommate. As I walked through the front door into the front room, I noticed something was different. Both the place and Sam. I couldn't quite place it. It was as if everything was moved slightly to the left or rotated just a degree or two. The place smelled funny, like new shoes, and Sam was waiting with his hands behind his back, smiling wide with a slight tilt to his head. He didn't look normal. His eyes seemed wider, mouth longer. Sam apologized for the previous fight and was adamant to tell me that his phone was stolen and he believes they had a break-in. Sam almost commands me to block the old number and to start using his new number which he provided. Sam didn't sound normal either. He sounded like he had just drank ice-cold water. Whatever the case, I didn't have to find a new roommate, so all was well. He would stay away more than usual. Something I would notice was he never seemed to change clothes either. About a month ago, I woke up to strange noises from in the living room. When I went to investigate, I found Sam standing in the middle of the room, in complete darkness. Thinking he was sleepwalking, I didn't want to disturb him, so I slowly crept away back to my bed. Almost finding it funny, I turned on my side to let the night take me away when I heard Sam returning to his bed, slowly creeping down the hall, but as he walked past my room, he looked right at me, with that wide smile, eyes piercing mine. This sent a jolt down my spine, and I quickly shut and locked the door. I tried not to come out at night anymore after that, as he stood like this in almost every room in the house after midnight, making weird clicking noises as he stood in the black abyss. One day, as I was running errands, I swore I saw Sam on multiple occasions, but when I got home, he was deep into cooking food, happy as ever to see me. I began to notice his features change even more over time. His eyes seemed to get deeper and bigger, mouth wider, and his build got taller and skinnier, and hair thinner and stiff like wire. He would stand in random rooms of the house every single night, making his clicking noises, and I would continue to think I saw him following me in public. I finally decided to find a new place to live, but I had to stay put for 3 months until the lease was up. When I told Sam that I wouldn't be renewing my end of the lease, his face grew long and cold. Saddened by this news, he did not ask any questions, just started making clicking noises, staring down at the floor. He then sparked up and attempted to go to his room when I confronted him about following me around town. Sam smiled and told me I wasn't going anywhere. Sam lunged towards me, a knife suddenly in hand. He got me right in the shoulder, but I was able to fight him off, which sent the knife flying away. Sam ran off as I called 911. At the hospital, I had received news that would shake me to the core. When asked who attacked me, I told them what had been going on the past couple months, to which the police said they would get back to me. The very next day, I found out the horrible truth. Sam, my ex-roommate, had moved out the very next day we got into our fight. Sam had moved 4 states away, having a job that would corroborate this, meaning Sam was not the one I had been living with this past couple months. Who the hell has taken the form of Sam and decided they wanted to torment me? The real Sam had told police that he received a text from me stating that he was kicking him out, that he would murder him and his entire family if he even tried to call the police. This scared him, enough to make the real Sam not come asking questions. The real Sam stated that not only his belongings, but every single item in the house was brought to the curb when he came to grab his stuff. He mentioned that I approached him and looked severely disheveled, almost morphed, commanding him to block my number and to never contact him again. The next night, I stayed in the hospital. I could see him standing in the parking lot, still using Sam's face, still stalking me. That moment I realized it was either me or him. No one was going to help me. They all thought I was crazy now. In order to leave the hospital, I had to talk to a shrink. As I waited to speak to this person, I saw a lady sitting alone, waiting in the corner of the waiting room, and she perked up when she caught my sight. She told me she overheard my story passing by in the hallway earlier, and she assured me I was not crazy. She claimed that the same thing happened to her a few years ago, and that, even though she killed the monster stalking her, it still haunted her. She told me about how her sister had come home one day different, much like Sam. She claimed that she tried to help her sister, but this thing was not who she had thought, and ultimately she was forced to kill the creature. She told me that she still saw her twisted face every now and then, and that's what keeps bringing her back there. Her name was Annie, and she told me I had to cut out the heart completely to kill the creatures. It was the only way, but to not return home to it. I needed to find him in public, but how would I do that? I was then called in to speak with the shrink, and I decided to be honest with him. When leaving the shrink's office, the girl was gone. I stayed for a couple more days at the hospital, as they suspected I may be suicidal. Each night, I would see a figure standing in the parking lot, and one time I swore I saw Sam walking by my door, just like that night he had been sleepwalking. But eventually I was deemed safe to be released, and with nowhere else to go, I went back home to grab my things, remembering Annie's words, but I had assumed there was no way Sam would be there. But once again I was wrong. As I entered my home, I began to smell a very strong chemical smell, and to my surprise I saw Sam there. Though not the real Sam, the monster hiding in Sam's image. He welcomed me home and offered to provide me with answers. I didn't want to hear anything that cold, deep voice was spouting, but I was very curious what hell this thing was and what it wanted. But would I even be able to believe it? No. This is exactly where he wanted me, and with this sharp intrusion of a realization, I decided to make a run for the back door. Sam did not chase after. He just smiled watching me race for the door. I gripped the handle and paced through, only to walk right through the front door of my house, into the front room. What? I didn't know what the hell just happened, so I turned right around and ran out the front door, only to now be coming in through the back door. I was trapped. Sam began to stretch out, quickly displaying sickly long arms and legs, like long branches peering off of a skinny, weathered trunk. Sam's jaw elongated, his eyes popping out of his skull, looking similar to a snail's. Sam then told me his real name, but I couldn't pronounce it if my life depended on it. He told me to continue using Sam, as he's grown fond of the human name. Branch-like hands then shot out of the ground and held me in place, and Sam told me where he was from and what he wanted. Sam was from an alternate plane, one that hosted many horrible evils. He told me some called it hell, and that may be the best way to explain it. But one day he slipped through the veil, and his innate instincts told him to blend in, to become human. For centuries, he would blend in, taking someone's identity and being an imposter, feeding on the lies, manipulation, benefiting in ways our human minds just can't understand. And so I sit here, trapped in some strange suspended version of my house, caught between a few different timelines. I know that sounds strange, but isn't all of this? In one reality, I'm still pinned to the floor with the strange branches clutching me tightly, Sam hissing and clicking in my face, feeding off my fear. In another reality I click forward to, I am sitting on my bed, typing this entire story out, hoping that it is read by someone who knows how to help me. The other two realities that I click forward into aren't really worth mentioning, but I will anyways. Hell, maybe it is relevant somehow? In one of them I'm actually a little girl, just a small child, one who looks strikingly familiar. The last one is a timeline where this creature never found me. I am enjoying my house with a lady who seems to be my wife and my small daughter. But we soon get a knock at the door. I stand up to get the door, but it always clicks forward to another timeline reality just as the door opens, and when it becomes time to return to this reality and resets to the beginning, and I never remember the outcome until after. I think I've found a way out of this loop, this prison that I seem to be stuck in. Someone has been knocking at the door to my room recently. I always figured it was Sam, but maybe it was something else, someone else. If you don't hear back from me, I either lost the fight and I'm doomed, or I won and somehow lost memory of this log. To the real Sam, I hope this monster hasn't found you like he did me. And to Annie, I hope that the hauntings have stopped for you. For now, this is goodbye. My son keeps talking to the audience. My son, Cade, is smart. He's only 6 years old, halfway through the first grade, and he's already begun reading books that even I struggle to get through. He's a sharp kid, but he has some quirks. And listen, all kids have quirks. One thing I've learned as a relatively new father is that kids are weird. They talk to the walls, eat bugs, see things in the reflection that aren't there. You get the gist. Kids really do the darndest things. But recently, my son has reached a new level of oddity. One that is out of my jurisdiction, as the oblivious goofball dad who still makes hot dogs for every meal. I became a single parent after my wife passed a few years back. It's been impossibly difficult. I won't sugarcoat it. Being the sole caretaker of Cade has been the single hardest thing I've ever had to do, next to attending my wife's funeral. Cade, though he was only 4 at the time, took his mother's passing hard. He would ask for her constantly, throwing wild fits, thrashing around like a fish out of water. At any minor inconvenience, he would beg for his mother. I didn't know how to handle it. He'd often throw tantrums in public, wailing like a banshee in Home Depot, as passers-by would stare with judgment spilling out of their wide eyes. I felt utterly helpless. All I could do was attempt to calm him in a hushed tone, promising that Daddy was there to help him. But Daddy was not enough. Every child needs their mother. I remember wishing I had the funds to take Cade to see a child psychologist, or at least a licensed medical professional. I work in construction and barely make enough to pay each month's rent, let alone provide health care for my poor son. Looking back now, I should have downsized so I could afford it. Cade's explosive fits continued until about a few months ago. These tantrums would occur every other day, if not daily. Then, suddenly, they dwindled to once a week. Then after another month, none at all. I was relieved, to say the least. It was a weight off my chest to avoid the pointed glares from strangers on the street as I'd haul a hysterical Cade into the car, practicing the patience I didn't know I had until fatherhood. But once Cade's meltdown ceased, a new issue presented itself. one that scared me far more than any tantrum I've seen him throw. Imaginary friends. I know what you're thinking. Every kid has imaginary friends, and you're right. But Cade's imaginary friends were a little bit different. He called them the audience. It began one night during dinner when I had the bright idea to sauté some spinach alongside boiling the usual hot dogs in hopes Cade would get his greens in somehow. I scooped a heap onto his plate and placed it in front of him, beckoning him to try. "It's good," I said, feigning a smile. "Popeye eats it to get big and strong." Cade looked at the plate, quizzically, looked at me, and looked back at the plate. He sat there for a while, staring the spinach down as if were the innards of an alien creature. He looked at me again as if I might be crazy, then pushed the plate away. "No, thank you." "Cade," I said warningly, my dad voice making an appearance. "You have to at least try it." Cade made a humming noise as if pondering this deeply and began to stroke his chin. "I'm not sure," he had said finally. "Let me ask the audience." Cade turned to face a window next to the kitchen table. The window faced our backyard. Though dusk had long since departed, the outside world was dark as doom. My son, staring out into a window of nothingness, appeared as if he were simply looking at his reflection. The lights in the kitchen and the contrasting darkness outside created a mirror-esque effect. "What do you think?" There was deafening silence for a moment. I arched an eyebrow, waiting for the imaginary response from this mysterious audience. It was the first time I'd heard him mention them. I figured it was his new, foolproof method of avoiding any vegetable consumption that evening. After a moment too long, Cade turned back around to face me. "They said no." I scoff and gesture to his plate once more. "I'm sure they did. Now go on. Have a bite." "No, I can't. I'm not allowed," he said again. "Cade, knock it off. Please eat your spinach." "No, Daddy, they said no." I had assumed he would whine like he usually did when he didn't get his way. But this time, his tone sounded different. Desperation clung to his voice as if he were begging me to understand. I dropped it. I was too tired to fight him. He went to bed with a belly full of hot dogs unaccompanied by sautéed spinach. Unfortunately, the audience wasn't as easy to get rid of as a plate of boiled hot dogs. The following week, Cade's imaginary friends made an appearance once again. I was trying to get Cade in his pajamas for bedtime. The usual routine went: pajamas, teeth brushing, bedtime story, lights out. Always the same order. But tonight was different. Cade decided to brush his teeth before changing into his pajamas. "What about PJs, buddy?" I asked him, curious about his change in routine. He had been doing this bedtime routine the same way since before my wife passed. I imagined the routine was comforting to him, reminding him of when my wife was still around, which is why it was so odd that he had decided to switch things up suddenly. "The audience told me to do it this way now," he replied with a mouthful of toothpaste froth. There they were, again, the audience. A sudden curiosity crept into my mind. Why? Cade glanced at his open bedroom window quickly. "I don't know. They just did." A sudden chill ran down my spine. I hadn't remembered those curtains being opened. Curtains are always closed before bedtime routine. I walked to the window and pulled them shut. After story time, when it was time for lights out, Cade refused to let me touch the light switch. "Dad, the audience wants the lights on." Cade cupped his tiny hands over the switch against his bedroom wall, creating a makeshift barrier, refusing to budge. I rolled my eyes. "Nice try, Cade, but the audience doesn't get to decide the rules." Fear flashed on Cade's face as he snapped his head to look at me, wide-eyed. "Don't say that, Daddy." His calm tone was eerie, and I took a step backward. "Cade, please. You can't stay up all night just because the audience told you to." "Yes, I can," Cade responded, his voice low. He was staring at the window, curtains closed and all. At this point, I was thoroughly unnerved, if I'm being honest. Something in my gut was telling me these imaginary friends were not very friendly. Not just an excuse to get out of vegetable eating, but an excuse for Cade to be up to no good. Even still, I had paternal duties to attend to. "Well, tell the audience to say goodnight." I scooped Cade into my arms despite his pleas and tiny fists of rage. I placed him gently on his bed and made my way towards his bedroom door, flicking the light switch off, signaling he had no choice in the matter. The lights in Cade's room remained on. I stopped in my tracks, spinning around, trying the switch once, twice, 3 times again. The lights didn't turn off. The switch must have been broken somehow, I thought. Despite my rational explanation for the phenomenon, the panic that began to bubble in my chest did not subside. "You're sleeping with me tonight." The next morning, the light switch started working again, and I was able to exhale the breath I hadn't realized I had been holding. But that feeling of relief didn't last long, as the week that followed was filled with even more peculiar coincidences. I say peculiar, but I think a more suited adjective would be horrifying. On Friday, Cade said the audience doesn't want him to go to school. I get a flat tire on my way to drop him off. On Monday, Cade says the audience doesn't like Jacob because he hogs the soccer ball during recess. On Tuesday, Jacob falls and breaks his arm. He'd be out of school for 2 weeks. On Thursday, Cade says the audience doesn't like Mr. Teddy, Cade's favorite stuffed animal, anymore. Mr. Teddy is found slashed open from the belly up, fluffy guts spilling from his abdomen. I began having trouble deciphering whether this was Cade's new method of acting out, or if there was really some ominous force at play. I could have rationed each occurrence away by blaming Cade, but I knew in my soul that Cade wasn't that kind of kid. He was sensitive and bright. He was no teddy bear killer. The audience began to infiltrate my thoughts more than I would have liked it to. It was all Cade talked about, and more often than not, the audience would lead Cade down the path of destruction. Everything came to a head this past Saturday night while I used the bathroom, leaving Cade unattended in the living room watching an episode of his show. As I was washing my hands, I heard a loud crash, followed by a glass shattering. I ran to the living room and found Cade, looking guilty as ever, standing next to a wedding picture of my wife and me, glass scattered across the hardwood floor, smashed to bits. My instinctual response was to make sure he wasn't hurt, which, thank God, he wasn't. But afterward, an inexplicable anger coursed through me. "Cade, why would you do something like that?" "It wasn't me. It was them. The Audi. Go to your room," I shouted, and Cade scurried up the stairs in tears. After a few minutes of feeling consumed with guilt, I started towards his room to apologize. I stood in front of the doorway for a moment, preparing myself for a long apology when I heard Cade's voice. He was talking to himself in his room. Well, he was speaking to someone, but I heard no response. "But I don't want to do that," I heard him murmur. "I love my daddy." I walked into Cade's room the second I heard him referring to me, and he looked spooked, like I had caught him with his hand in the cookie jar. He was positioned by the window, kneeling, facing the blackness of the night beyond. I could have sworn I saw something moving by the window, a figure cloaked by the lightless sky. "Cade?" I said, slowly. "Who are you talking to in here?" Cade didn't respond. Instead, he got to his feet, arms hanging by his sides, and dramatically flopped onto his bed, face pressed into the mattress. This was Cade talk for "get the hell out of my room." Though I was still fixated on the window, exposed by the open curtains, I snapped out of my trance to focus on my priorities. "Cade," I say softly, "Daddy is very sorry for yelling." Cade let out a humph, but kept his face against the mattress, refusing to look at me. "Is there something you want to talk about? Maybe a reason why you're feeling sad?" I tried to coax it out of him, but he wouldn't budge. "It wasn't me," he had said, his voice muffled by the bedding. "It was them." "You didn't break that picture of Mommy and I?" "No, it was them." His voice cracked, and he lifted his face, tears spilling down his cheeks. "They're everywhere, Daddy. I don't like them anymore." "Who, Cade? Who is everywhere?" Cade was practically choking on his sobs now. "The audience. They told me that you don't like me anymore because Mommy died. They told me Mommy got sick and lost all her hair, and now she's in the ground." My chest seized up. "Cade, who told you that?" I had never told him his mother had gotten cancer. I rarely ever speak of her passing, for that matter. My wife and I had purposely sheltered him from the very end of her life, only allowing the happy memories to seep through the cracks of his memory. "They did. They told me to open all the curtains so they could get you, Daddy." As much as I hate to admit it, at that moment, I was terrified. I felt my heart rate spike as I watched my son, dripping in saliva and salty tears, imagining phantom arms reaching through the windowsills and dragging us into a never-ending nothingness. "Sweetheart," I take a deep breath, attempting to steady my voice. "There's no such thing as the audience. They're imaginary. They're not going to get either of us. You're safe and sound here with me." I pulled him into a hug, squeezing him tightly as if to show this audience they were not taking away my Cade. "They're real," I heard him whisper, his head buried in my shoulder. That night, I lay with him in bed until he fell asleep. I was careful not to wake him as I kissed his rosy, tear-streaked cheeks goodnight, ensuring he was finally out. I felt at peace knowing he was tucked in bed. Safe. I made my way downstairs to tidy up the kitchen, cleaning the pile of stray dishes left from dinner. I went over to the sink and began scrubbing. I had only gotten through maybe 3 or 4 when I saw something out of the corner of my eye. I froze instinctively, fixating on the pan in the sink, mid-scrub. There was something in the window, something my intuition was screaming at me not to look at. It was peeking at me, rising slowly into my peripheral vision. I felt the hairs on my arms rise, a chill running through me. Something was right in front of me, standing in front of the window. I couldn't bring myself to look. If I'm being completely honest, I was scared shitless. I could feel it staring at me, its eyes burning into the top of my head. I was afraid that if I acknowledged it, it would truly and entirely exist. In my motionless trance, I felt them begin to appear. They were all around me, their presences, one by one, being made known in front of every window of the house. This was their debut. I could feel each one in my bones, peering at first, then slowly rising in front of each open window in our home until they had reached their full length. Then they were all around me, staring at me through a thin sheet of glass. It was only a matter of time. I couldn't move, aside from my shaking hand still clutching that bubble-soaked pan in the kitchen sink. All I could think about was my son. Cade was still upstairs. I couldn't abandon him. These things had been tormenting him for weeks, and now was my chance to put a stop to it, to protect him. I knew I had only one option at this point. I sprang into action, launching myself from the kitchen sink and racing to my son's room. I saw them in the windows. They didn't move, didn't even flinch, as I bounded up the stairs. They were colorless blurs as I ran past them, realizing then, and only then, that my house had far too many windows. I could make out some of their features, and honestly, I wish I hadn't. Their eyes bulged unnaturally, so wide you could see the whites of them from top to bottom. And their mouths gaped open like the Scream painting, far too wide for any human caliber, as if they had unhinged their jaws. Their skin was moist and pale and hairless, with swollen heads and skinny necks, bone-thin bodies, gawking at me with that fixed expression. As if they were enthralled, captivated by the show. But there were no screams, none except for my own, of course. No sounds besides the thumping of my heart as it hammered into my chest. I nearly tore Cade's door off of his hinges, finding him sleeping peacefully in bed. That's where we've been for the past few hours, hiding under his covers, waiting for this nightmare to end, if it ever does. All I know is this: if your kid ever tells you they're talking to the audience, run.